I built an empire from the dirt up only to have my own flesh and blood treat me like dirt. During Easter dinner, my son slammed his fist on the table and called me useless. Then his wife laughed and threw a glass of red wine straight into my face. They thought I was just a senile old man who could not fight back. They had no idea that their little stunt was the exact signal I had been waiting for. I did not scream. I just walked out, got into my car, and texted my lawyer. 20 minutes later, the federal agents were breaking down their door. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe disrespecting the person who fed you should come with a massive price tag. My name is Desmond Crawford. Most people in the industry call me Des. I am 73 years old. 40 years ago, with nothing but a used flatbed truck, a stack of unpaid bills, and a promise to my late wife Yvonne, I built Crawford Logistics into one of the most profitable freight companies on the East Coast. We did not have old money or family connections to rely on. We had grit, sweat, and absolute loyalty to our people. But when my beautiful Yvonne passed away 5 years ago, a large part of my spirit went with her. I stepped back from the daily corporate grind and handed the reins of the company over to our only son, Terrell. I thought I was passing the torch to a capable, honorable man who respected the legacy we built together. Instead, I handed the keys to a kingdom to a boy who only wanted to wear the crown. Terrell is 40 years old now, but he operates with the maturity of a spoiled teenager. He married a woman named Brittany. She is 35, white, and comes from a family of local country club elites who always look down their noses at everyone else. Her family had social status, but their money was drying up fast. My son had the actual money, but he was completely desperate for their validation. It was a toxic, miserable combination. Brittany and her family made a sport out of dropping subtle, condescending remarks about my background, my clothes, and my simple habits. To them, I was just the unrefined, old black man taking up space in a world I did not truly belong to. For the last 8 months, I had been playing a very specific part. I let my hands shake. I acted forgetful. I mumbled my words. I needed them to drop their guard because I was watching them bleed my company dry. This all came to a violent boiling point on Easter Sunday. The dinner was hosted at my house. Well, it is the sprawling luxury mansion that I paid for in cash, which they currently occupied. Brittany had invited her parents, Richard and Susan, along with her older brother, Chad. Chad was a tech bro, the kind of guy who used corporate buzzwords to cover up the fact that he had never worked a hard day in his life. They sat around my massive custom mahogany dining table, drinking my expensive imported wine, acting like they owned the very air in the room. Terrell sat at the head of the table, a spot that rightfully belonged to me. He was swirling his heavy crystal glass and complaining loudly to Richard about how Crawford Logistics was facing a severe cash flow crisis. He had the absolute nerve to look right at me across the table and blame my historical business models for his current financial disasters. He told his arrogant father-in-law that I had left the company stuck in the dark ages, weighed down by bloated pension plans for truck drivers and outdated vendor contracts. The absolute truth was that Terrell and Brittany had been actively embezzling millions of dollars from the corporate accounts to fund their lavish lifestyle, but I kept my mouth shut. I just sat there looking down at my plate. I reached for my water glass and deliberately let my hand tremble violently. I knocked my silver fork off the edge of the table. It clattered loudly against the imported stone floor, echoing through the large dining room. The entire room went dead silent. Brittany let out an exaggerated, highly dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in her head. Her mother, Susan, whispered something under her breath to Richard and shook her head in pure disgust. Chad let out a smug little chuckle while checking his expensive watch. Terrell slammed his hand down on the table so hard the silverware jumped. "You are useless!" he shouted at me, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red. "You cannot even hold a simple fork anymore. You are ruining the company, you are ruining my reputation, and now you are ruining my dinner." I looked at my son, the boy I had sacrificed my youth for, the boy Yvonne had loved more than breathing, and I saw an absolute stranger. Then Brittany laughed. It was a cold, piercing, cruel sound that echoed in the quiet room. She picked up her heavy glass of dark red wine and casually, almost playfully, tossed the contents straight across the table. The dark liquid splashed directly into my face, burning my eyes and soaked deeply into my chest. The room gasped, but nobody moved to stop her. It was not just any shirt she ruined. It was a pale blue linen button-down that my Yvonne had bought for me on our very last anniversary trip to the coast. It was one of the few physical things I had left of her. The wine stained it, instantly spreading over my heart like a bleeding wound. The disrespect hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. Her family just watched, smirking, waiting for me to break down, yell, or cry like a helpless, senile old man. I did none of those things. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse at them. I slowly took off my wire-rimmed glasses. I picked up my cloth napkin and deliberately wiped the wine from my eyes and my cheeks. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and looked at Terrell one last time. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second before he cowardly looked away. I did not say a single word. I turned my back and walked slowly, steadily out of the dining room, leaving them to their arrogant little feast. I walked out the heavy front doors and stepped into the cool, crisp evening air. I climbed into the driver's seat of my old SUV parked at the far edge of the driveway. I wiped the last drop of red wine from my chin, feeling the cold dampness on my favorite shirt. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened a secure message thread to my senior corporate lawyer, Kendrick. I typed 3 simple words. It is time. I hit send. I rolled down my window and leaned back against the leather seat, staring at the brightly lit mansion. In the distance, cutting through the quiet suburban night, I could hear the faint rising wail of heavy sirens heading straight for us. I drove exactly 1 block down the street and pulled my SUV to the curb under the heavy shadow of a massive oak tree. I turned off the engine but kept the windows rolled down. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of impending rain and blooming jasmine. I sat there in the dark, letting the red wine seep deeper into my favorite blue linen shirt. It was cold and sticky against my chest, but I did not try to wipe it away. I wanted to feel it. I wanted the physical reminder of their absolute disrespect to ground me in what was about to happen next. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hands were resting on the steering wheel, completely steady. The violent tremors I had displayed in the dining room just 10 minutes ago were entirely gone. They were never real. For the past 8 months, I had played the role of a fading patriarch. I let my voice waver. I let my memory slip. I let my shoulders hunch. I made them believe that my mind was slowly slipping into the fog of old age because an arrogant thief will never suspect a senile old man of tracking their every single move. It started late last summer. I had retained a habit of quietly reviewing the quarterly financial reports for Crawford Logistics. It was my company, after all. I built it from a single rusty truck, and my name was still on the building. I promised my late wife, Yvonne, that I would protect our legacy. I noticed minor discrepancies at first: vendor invoices that seemed slightly inflated, routing logs that reported heavy fuel costs but no actual cargo was ever moved. I quietly hired a brilliant forensic accountant completely off the books. What she uncovered was a financial bloodbath that nearly stopped my heart. Terrell and Brittany were not just skimming a little off the top to fund their country club lifestyle. They were actively bleeding my company dry. They had set up a complex network of shell companies and fake vendor accounts, routing millions of dollars of corporate revenue straight into offshore accounts and private luxury real estate trusts. They were using my life work as a personal piggy bank. While they were buying designer clothes and taking luxury vacations, they were laying off loyal truck drivers who had families to feed. They were cutting health benefits for the mechanics who had been with me since the very beginning. I could have walked into the boardroom and fired him on the spot. I could have handled it privately, like a family matter. But when you steal millions of dollars and commit federal fraud, you do not just burn your own house down. You risk bringing the entire company down with you. You risk the livelihoods of 500 honest employees. I had to build a case so airtight that the federal government would have no choice but to completely separate Terrell from the corporate entity. So I played the fool. I let Brittany roll her eyes at me. I let her arrogant father Richard mock my background. I let them treat me like a burden. And while they were laughing at me, I gathered every single wire transfer, every fake invoice, and every digital footprint they left behind. I handed it all to my lawyer, Kendrick, who walked it straight into the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I looked at the glowing green clock on my dashboard. 19 minutes had passed since I sent the text message to Kendrick. The trap was already in motion long before I dropped my fork at the dinner table. The dinner was just the final confirmation I needed that there was absolutely no humanity left in my son. I felt a brief pang of sorrow for the boy I used to know, but that boy was dead. The man sitting at the head of my table was a criminal. The distant wail of sirens suddenly cut off. That is how the federal agents operate when they are moving in for a major takedown. They kill the sirens blocks away to prevent the targets from flushing evidence down the toilet or slipping out the back door. I watched through my windshield as 4 matte black tactical SUVs turned the corner without a single headlight on. They moved like silent, massive predators gliding down the manicured suburban street. They swerved violently into the wide, circular driveway of my mansion, blocking the exits and trapping the luxury cars belonging to Brittany and her arrogant family. The doors of the SUVs flew open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. More than a dozen agents poured out into the night. They were not local beat cops responding to a domestic disturbance. They were men and women wearing heavy tactical vests with the bright yellow letters FBI and IRS emblazoned across their backs. They did not politely ring the doorbell. They did not wait for anyone to answer. 2 agents carrying a heavy steel battering ram marched straight up the grand front steps. I heard the explosive booming sound of solid oak and reinforced glass shattering inward. The front doors of the mansion were blown completely open. The tactical team flooded into the grand foyer. Instantly, the quiet, wealthy neighborhood was filled with the sounds of pure, absolute chaos. I could hear men shouting clear commands to get down on the floor. I heard the high-pitched, hysterical screams of Brittany and her mother Susan echoing out into the front yard. I heard the loud crash of expensive dining chairs being overturned and crystal wine glasses shattering against the imported stone floors. The elegant Easter dinner had just turned into a federal crime scene. Lights flicked on in the neighboring houses. Dogs started barking down the street. I sat in the dark cabin of my car watching the beautiful destruction unfold with perfect clarity. A few minutes later, the ruined front doors opened again. 2 large federal agents walked out dragging a man between them. It was Terrell. His expensive tailored suit jacket was ripped at the shoulder. His hands were yanked aggressively behind his back and secured with heavy steel handcuffs. He was stumbling, his feet slipping on the broken glass of the front porch. His face was an absolute mask of terror. The arrogant corporate king who had just slammed his fist on the table and called his father useless was now weeping like a frightened child. He looked wildly around the driveway, seeing the flashing red and blue lights silently spinning in the dark, reflecting off the badges of the federal agents. Then he saw my familiar SUV parked down the street under the shadow of the oak tree. He dragged his feet, trying to stop the agents from pulling him toward the transport vehicle. "Dad!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice cracked, echoing down the quiet suburban block. "Dad, please tell them to stop. I am sorry about the wine. I am so sorry Brittany threw the wine at you. Tell the police it was just a family argument. Tell them it was a mistake. Dad, please." I slowly rolled up my window, shutting out his pathetic cries. He actually thought this was about a stained shirt. He thought I had called the local police to complain about a disrespectful dinner guest. He was so completely blinded by his own arrogance that he had absolutely no idea that the men throwing him into the back of a federal transport vehicle were there for wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He had no idea he was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The operation was executed flawlessly. I put my car in gear and drove away from the flashing lights. But putting my son in handcuffs was only the very first step of a much larger war. Tomorrow morning, the real battle would begin. And Brittany was about to find out that throwing wine at the king only guarantees that you will drown in the fallout. The morning after the raid was the most peaceful Sunday I had experienced in 5 years. I woke up at 5 o'clock, just as the sun was beginning to break over the city skyline. I did not wake up in the massive suburban mansion where I had been insulted and humiliated the night before. I woke up in my private corporate penthouse downtown. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city wake up. My hands were perfectly steady. The fake tremors, the hunched posture, the confused old man routine, they were all completely gone. I was Desmond Crawford again. I was the founder and majority shareholder of Crawford Logistics, and I was finally taking my empire back. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my personal smartphone vibrated on the glass coffee table. It was not my lawyer. It was an automated voice system from the federal holding facility located just outside the city limits. The robotic voice informed me that I had a collect call from an inmate. I took a slow sip of my coffee, pressed the button to accept the charges, and put the phone on speaker. Dad, Terrell said. His voice was loud, fast, and dripping with that same obnoxious entitlement he had displayed at the dinner table. He was not crying anymore. The initial shock of the tactical raid had worn off, and his deep-rooted arrogance had violently returned. He honestly believed that the entire federal operation was just a massive clerical error. He thought it was a bureaucratic mistake made by some low-level tax auditor. He was annoyed that his perfect holiday weekend had been interrupted. Dad listened to me closely. Terrell commanded, speaking to me as if I was his slow-witted assistant. You need to call our private wealth manager at the bank right now. Tell him to liquidate whatever bonds are necessary and wire the bail money directly to the federal courthouse. They are holding me and Brittany in these filthy concrete holding cells. It smells like bleach and sweat in here. They took my shoelaces and my watch. This is an absolute outrage. Get on the phone and fix this immediately. Tell the lawyers to sue the police department for harassment. I have a golf tournament next weekend, and I am not spending another minute in this disgusting place. I sat in my leather armchair and just listened to him. I let him talk. I let him dig his own grave a little deeper. He was demanding that I drain my own accounts to rescue him from a federal prison after he had spent the last 8 months actively stealing millions of dollars from the very company I built with my bare hands. He threw a glass of wine in my face, and now he wanted me to hand him the keys to the vault. When he finally paused to take a breath, I leaned forward. You think this is a mistake, Terrell? I asked. My voice was no longer the wavering, fragile whisper of a senile old man. It was deep, resonant, and as cold as solid ice. It was the voice of the man who used to negotiate multi-million-dollar shipping contracts with the most ruthless mobsters on the East Coast. Terrell hesitated for a second, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in my tone. What are you talking about? He snapped. Of course it is a mistake. Some idiot at the IRS flagged our vendor accounts. It is just a misunderstanding with the new tax software. Just call the bank, Dad, and stop asking stupid questions. I am the chief executive officer of this company, and I am telling you to authorize the wire transfer right now. I took another sip of my coffee. You are not the chief executive officer of anything, I said, quietly. The line went dead silent. The heavy background noise of the holding facility seemed to fade away. What did you just say? Terrell asked, his voice dropping an entire octave. At 7 o'clock this morning, I convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors. I told him, as the founder and majority shareholder, I exercised my executive right to completely restructure the corporate leadership. Your title has been officially stripped. Your security clearance has been permanently revoked. You were terminated for gross financial misconduct exactly 1 hour ago. Dad, Terrell stammered, panic finally starting to crack through his arrogant facade. Dad, you cannot do that. You are retired. You do not have the authority. You do not know what is going on. I know absolutely everything, Terrell, I said, letting the absolute weight of my words crush his chest. I know about the shell companies you set up in Delaware. I know about the fake vendor invoices you used to siphon corporate funds into your private offshore accounts. I know about the $2 million you embezzled to buy that vacation home for Brittany and her arrogant parents. I know you have been bleeding my life work completely dry while treating me like a worthless piece of garbage in my own home. He was breathing heavily into the receiver. The realization was hitting him like a freight train. He finally understood that the old man he had been mocking and dismissing for 8 months was the exact same man who had orchestrated the entire federal raid. You called, the FBI, Terrell, whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. You set us up. I did not set you up, I corrected him. I just handed them the receipts for the trap you built yourself. And as for your demand for bail money, you can forget about it. I have officially frozen every single personal and corporate bank account tied to your name. Your platinum credit cards are dead. Your trust fund access is locked. Your luxury cars are being repossessed by the bank as we speak. You have absolutely nothing left. Dad, please, Terrell begged. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a broken boy. You cannot leave me in here. The federal agents are talking about 20 years in prison. They are talking about wire fraud and money laundering. Dad, I am your son. You have to help me. I am sorry about the dinner. I am sorry about what Brittany did. I will pay it all back, I swear. Just please call the bank. You sat at my table and called me useless, I reminded him. You watched your wife throw wine on the shirt your mother bought for me, and you did absolutely nothing. You are a coward, Terrell. You let a toxic woman and her greedy family turn you into a common thief. I am not calling the bank. I am not calling the lawyers. You are going to sit in that concrete cell, and you are going to learn what happens when you bite the hand that built your entire world. I did not wait for his response. I pressed the red button and ended the call, leaving him completely isolated in a federal cage. I set the phone down and let out a long, slow breath. It was the hardest thing a father could ever do, but a rotten branch must be cut off before it poisons the entire tree. I had to protect the legacy Yvonne and I built. I had to protect the 500 employees who relied on Crawford Logistics to feed their families. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Kendrick, my senior corporate attorney. Desmond, we have a massive problem, Kendrick said, his voice tense and urgent. What is it? I asked, standing up and walking toward the closet to grab my suit jacket. It is Brittany, Kendrick reported. She is out. How is that possible? I demanded. I froze all their assets. The judge set her bail at $250,000. She does not have access to that kind of cash. She did not use cash, Kendrick explained. Her parents, Richard and Susan, panicked when the federal agents dragged their precious daughter away. They went to a shady bail bondsman at the crack of dawn. They put up their own country club estate as collateral to secure her temporary release. The judge granted it because she is technically a first-time offender. She walked out of the federal courthouse 10 minutes ago. Where is she going? I asked, sliding my arms into my tailored jacket. She is not going home, Desmond Kendrick said. Our private security team just tracked her location. She hailed a taxi outside the courthouse, and she is heading straight for the Crawford Logistics corporate headquarters. She knows the federal agents only seized the physical documents at the house. She is going to the downtown office to wipe the main financial servers and destroy the digital archives before the IRS auditors arrive on Monday morning. She is desperate, Desmond. She is going to burn the evidence. I felt a cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. Brittany thought she was being clever. She thought she could outsmart the old man one more time. She thought she could just walk into my building and erase her crimes. She had absolutely no idea that I had been anticipating her next move since the moment she threw that glass of wine. Tell the security team to let her into the building, I told Kendrick. Do not stop her at the front desk. Let her go all the way up to the executive floor. Let her walk right into the finance department. Are you sure, Desmond Kendrick asked, if she accesses those servers we could lose the primary ledgers? She is not going to access anything, I said, buttoning my jacket. Because I am going to be sitting right there, waiting for her when she walks through the door. I grabbed my keys and walked out of the penthouse. The real war was just beginning, and I was going to make sure Brittany deeply regretted the day she ever decided to cross paths with Desmond Crawford. The corporate headquarters of Crawford Logistics is a massive fortress made of glass and steel, towering over the downtown financial district. It was early Sunday morning, and the building was completely empty. I sat quietly in the heavy shadows of the senior finance department. My lawyer Kendrick stood completely silent by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sleeping city. We did not turn on the overhead lights. We waited patiently in the dim morning glow. I looked at the long rows of high-end computer servers humming quietly in the climate-controlled glass room. Those servers contained the absolute financial heartbeat of my entire empire. This was the exact department where my late wife Yvonne used to balance our company ledgers by hand 40 years ago, sitting at a cheap folding table late into the night. Now the arrogant woman who threw a glass of red wine onto her memory was coming here to burn it all to the ground. I heard the heavy glass doors of the executive floor slide open violently. The private elevator chimed. High heels clicked frantically and unevenly against the polished hardwood floor. She was running. Brittany burst through the double doors of the finance department like a cornered wild animal. She looked absolutely pathetic. The pristine white country club princess who always looked down her nose at me was completely gone. Her blonde hair was a tangled, greasy mess. She was wearing the exact same designer clothes from the Easter dinner, but they were deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat from spending the night in a filthy federal holding cell. She was carrying a heavy metal hammer with a bright red handle. She must have broken the glass of the emergency firebox in the hallway to get it. She was panting heavily, her eyes darting around the dark room searching for the main data terminals. She ran straight toward the primary server rack. She raised the heavy metal hammer high above her head, fully intending to smash the master hard drives into tiny, irreparable pieces to hide her massive financial crimes. I reached out and flipped the master switch on the desk. The bright fluorescent overhead lights flickered to life, instantly blinding her. "Drop the hammer, Brittany," I said. My voice echoed through the large open room, cold, sharp, and echoing with absolute authority. She let out a loud, terrified shriek and dropped the tool. The hammer hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, solid thud. She spun around, shielding her eyes from the sudden bright light. When her vision finally cleared and she saw me sitting comfortably at the head of the long mahogany conference table next to my lawyer, her face turned the color of pure ash. She was completely paralyzed. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, taking a shaky step backward. "This is a restricted corporate area. You are retired. I am the acting vice president of operations, and I demand that you leave my office immediately." She actually tried to use a fake corporate title to intimidate the man who literally owned the entire building. It was beyond delusional. Her arrogance was so deeply ingrained that even when caught red-handed, she tried to play the superior aristocrat. I slowly stood up from the expensive leather executive chair. I picked up a thick, heavy manila folder resting on the table. I walked slowly toward her. "You are not the vice president of anything, Brittany," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and completely steady. "You are a federal criminal out on a temporary bail bond secured by your parents' mortgaged house. And you just broke into a secure corporate facility with a weapon intending to destroy financial evidence. That is legally defined as tampering with an active federal investigation. Kendrick already sent the security camera footage of you walking through the lobby straight to the district attorney. Your bail is going to be permanently revoked by noon today." She started hyperventilating. Her chest heaved as the reality of her situation violently crashed down on her. "You cannot do this to me," she cried, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "We are family, Desmond. I am your daughter-in-law. You do not treat your own family like this. We just made a small mistake." I stopped a few feet away from her. I slammed the thick folder down onto the glass desk right in front of her. The loud smack made her jump out of her skin. "Family does not bleed you dry," I said. I opened the folder displaying the documents. "Let us talk about your brother Chad. Let us talk about the brilliant young tech entrepreneur who always smirked at my clothes and thought he was better than the rest of the world." Brittany stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. She looked at the papers on the desk and her entire body began to tremble. "Yes, I know all about Chad," I continued, watching the horror bloom on her pale face. "My forensic accountant completely unraveled the fake vendor contracts you and Terrell set up. You created 3 different phantom consulting firms registered to a cheap post office box in Delaware. For the past 8 months, you have been authorizing monthly corporate payments of $50,000 to those fraudulent firms for software optimization services that absolutely never existed." I tapped my finger hard against the highlighted bank routing numbers on the documents. "You were using my company to pay your lazy, arrogant brother a massive fake salary just so he could pretend to be a successful Silicon Valley startup founder," I told her. "You funded his entire fake life, his expensive sneakers, his luxury apartment, and his arrogant attitude with my stolen money. You turned your own brother into an accessory to federal money laundering." She stared at the undeniable proof of her ultimate betrayal. She realized she had not just ruined her own life, but she had dragged her precious golden child brother into a massive federal indictment. But instead of apologizing, instead of dropping to her knees and begging for mercy, her toxic country club entitlement violently kicked in one last time. She squared her shoulders and glared at me with pure venom in her eyes. "You think you are so smart, old man," she hissed, spitting the words at me like poison. "You think you can just snap your fingers and destroy my life and my family? You think you are completely untouchable just because your name is on the building? If you hand those papers to the federal agents, I swear to God I will make sure you go down right next to me." I tilted my head, looking at her with genuine curiosity. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Brittany?" I asked. She smiled, a nasty, desperate, and ugly smile. "I will go to the press," she threatened, stepping closer to me. "I will go to the major news networks and tell them exactly how Crawford Logistics really operates. I will tell them you pay off union bosses to keep your drivers quiet. I will tell them you deliberately cut corners on federal safety regulations to build your precious fortune. I will tell the federal agents that you ordered me to set up those offshore accounts to hide your own dirty money. I will drag your pristine reputation through the mud and expose every single dirty secret this company has. I will destroy your legacy before I ever let you lock me in a cage." I looked at her desperate, hateful face. I looked at the woman who threw wine on my favorite shirt and called me useless just 24 hours ago. And then I started to laugh. I did not just chuckle. I laughed a deep, genuine, booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the finance department. Brittany looked completely confused. Her confident, threatening smirk faltered. She did not understand why her ultimate blackmail attempt was highly amusing to me. "You think this is funny?" she yelled, her voice echoing shrilly. "You think I am bluffing?" I stopped laughing. I stepped right into her personal space, forcing her to look up into my dark, unwavering eyes. I built this empire with my own two bare hands. I told her, my voice resonating with absolute, unquestionable power. 40 years ago, I was hauling heavy freight through the absolute worst blizzards on the East Coast. I ate cheap cold sandwiches in the cab of my truck so I could afford to pay my men. I never missed a payroll. I never cheated a driver out of a single dime. I never paid a single illegal bribe. My hands are calloused and my back is tired because I did the hard, honest work that parasites like you and your brother think you are too good to do. I leaned in closer so she could feel the absolute certainty in my words. "My company is completely clean," I whispered. "My legacy is absolutely untouchable. I do not have a single skeleton in my closet for you to find. If you want to go to the federal agents and tell them a fairy tale, you go right ahead. Go to the press. Tell them whatever you want to tell them. They will look at the hard physical evidence sitting on this table. They will look at your fake phantom companies, and they will laugh you right out of the room." I turned to my lawyer, who was already holding his phone. "Kendrick," I said calmly, "call corporate security. Have this woman escorted off the premises and make sure the local police are waiting for her in the main lobby. Her bail conditions state she cannot be near company property." Brittany started screaming hysterically as the reality of her total destruction finally set in. She lunged forward, trying to grab the folder off the desk, but Kendrick easily pulled it away from her reach. She sobbed and cursed my name, but I was already turning my back on her. Putting Brittany back in a concrete cell was only part of the plan. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. I had one more stop to make today. Chad had been spending my hard-earned money pretending to be a self-made genius. It was time to show that arrogant boy what a real self-made man looks like when he comes to collect his debts. I returned to my mansion later that afternoon. The front doors had already been replaced by my security team, and the broken glass from the federal raid was completely swept away. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat in my leather armchair, enjoying the absolute silence of my reclaimed home. But toxic people are like weeds. If you do not pull them up by the absolute deepest roots, they will always find a way to creep back into your yard. The heavy brass knocker on my front door began to pound aggressively. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the entitled pounding of someone who believed they owned the world. I did not call my security team. I walked over and opened the heavy oak door myself. Standing on my front porch was Chad. He was Brittany's older brother. He was the kind of guy who wore $1,000 sneakers with custom-tailored sweatpants and thought he was a Silicon Valley visionary. He ran a tech startup downtown that developed some useless logistics application. For years, he had looked down his nose at my traditional freight business, calling my methods dinosaur tactics. He loved to brag at family dinners about how he was a self-made disruptor in the tech space. He pushed his way past me, stepping right into my grand foyer without an invitation. His face was red and he was pointing a trembling finger right at my chest. "Listen to me, you vindictive old man!" Chad yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I know exactly what you did to my sister. You set her up. You sent the federal agents to her house to ruin her life because you are a bitter, jealous dinosaur who cannot handle the fact that Terrell and Brittany were moving this company into the modern age." I calmly closed the front door. I did not raise my voice. I just looked at him with absolute profound pity. "You broke into my home to give me a lecture, Chad?" I asked, walking back toward my leather armchair. "I came here to give you an ultimatum," Chad spat, crossing his arms. He paced across the imported rug, trying to look intimidating. "You are going to call your expensive lawyers, and you are going to drop every single civil and criminal charge against Brittany right now. If you do not, I am going to completely destroy you. I have massive connections in the tech media. I have thousands of followers. I will go on every major podcast and business blog, and I will expose you. I will tell the entire world that Desmond Crawford is a predatory, abusive billionaire who exploits his own family and uses federal agents to bully his daughter-in-law. I will cancel you and your entire prehistoric trucking company by tomorrow morning." He stood there breathing heavily, completely convinced that his little social media threat had me backed into a corner. He honestly believed that a 73-year-old man who had survived the most ruthless commercial real estate and freight wars of the 1980s was going to be terrified of a tech bro with a podcast microphone. I sat down in my armchair and took a slow sip of my bourbon. "Chad," I said quietly, "do you know why I never invested a single dime into your tech startup when you begged me for seed money 3 years ago?" Chad sneered. "Because you are too old to understand the future of logistics," he snapped. "No," I corrected him. "Because I know a fraud when I see one. You talk about being a self-made disruptor. You boast about your genius business model. But we both know you never actually secured any legitimate angel investors to get your company off the ground. You used my money." Chad's confident, arrogant posture suddenly stiffened. His eyes darted nervously around the room. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "My forensic accountant tracked every single stolen dollar, Chad," I explained, letting the absolute reality of his situation crush him. Brittany embezzled millions from Crawford Logistics. But she did not just buy designer dresses and luxury vacations. She routed over $2 million of my corporate funds through phantom consulting firms in Delaware straight into your startup. Your entire company was built on stolen federal funds. You are not a genius tech entrepreneur. You are a recipient of laundered money." "That is a lie," Chad shouted, but his voice cracked with pure panic. "You cannot prove any of that. My venture capital firm just cleared a $10 million Series A funding round for me. I am backed by the biggest investors in the state." I smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that made the blood drain entirely from his face. "You were backed by the biggest investors in the state," I corrected him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not call the police. I did not call my security guards. I called a man named Marcus Vance. Marcus was the senior managing partner of the exact venture capital fund that had just promised Chad his massive $10 million expansion check. Marcus and I had played poker together for 15 years. We sat on 3 different corporate boards together. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the glass coffee table right in front of Chad. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "Desmond, my friend," the executive said warmly. "It is good to hear your voice." "Marcus," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on Chad's pale, sweating face. "I need to inform you of a severe compliance issue regarding one of your recent startup acquisitions, the company run by Chad." Chad lunged forward trying to grab the phone, but I simply raised my hand and pointed a single commanding finger at him, stopping him dead in his tracks. "What is the issue?" Desmond Marcus asked, his tone instantly shifting to strict business. "The seed money used to establish Chad's company was actively embezzled from Crawford Logistics," I stated clearly. "My son and his wife stole the funds and laundered them into his startup. The FBI and the IRS have already executed tactical raids on my former executives, and the indictments for wire fraud are being processed as we speak. If your venture capital firm transfers that $10 million funding round to Chad, your entire portfolio will be legally tied to a federal money laundering and racketeering investigation. I'm giving you a professional courtesy heads-up, Marcus, before the federal agents freeze his accounts." There was a heavy, dead silence on the speakerphone. I could hear the sound of Marcus typing furiously on a keyboard in the background. "Desmond, I owe you one," Marcus finally said, his voice ice cold. "I am killing the funding round immediately. We are withdrawing all financial backing and issuing a corporate disavowal notice within the hour. That boy is officially radioactive. Thank you for the warning." Marcus hung up the phone. The loud click echoed through my silent living room. Chad stood completely frozen. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, but absolutely no words came out. His phone began to vibrate wildly in his custom sweatpants pocket. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. I watched as his screen lit up with emergency notifications from his banking applications, his board members, and his legal team. The $10 million funding was gone. His startup was dead. His reputation in the tech industry was completely incinerated in less than 5 minutes. He dropped his phone onto the expensive rug. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor right in front of me. The arrogant tech bro who had kicked down my door to threaten me was now hyperventilating on his hands and knees, weeping like a broken child. He had absolutely nothing left. "Get off my floor, Chad," I said, my voice devoid of any pity. "You tried to use my stolen money to buy a crown you did not earn. Now you get to explain to the federal auditors exactly how you funded your fake empire. Walk out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing." Chad did not argue. He did not issue any more empty threats. He pulled himself up off the floor, completely shattered, and stumbled blindly out the front door. I picked up my glass of bourbon and took a slow, satisfying sip. The perimeter was secure, but the war inside the federal holding cells was just beginning. Brittany had just lost her wealthy parents, her stolen house, and now the brother she had risked federal prison to enrich was completely bankrupt. She had absolutely no lifelines left. A toxic rat backed into a corner will always turn and bite the closest thing to it. And the closest thing to Brittany right now was my cowardly son, Terrell. They were locked in a concrete cage together, and the absolute destruction of their marriage was about to be a masterpiece. There is a profound difference between a person who makes a mistake and a person who is fundamentally corrupt. When a good person is caught doing something wrong, they feel shame. They apologize. They try to make amends. But when a truly corrupt person is backed into a corner, they do not feel remorse. They only feel a desperate, vicious need to survive, no matter who they have to destroy in the process. Brittany was fundamentally corrupt. I had stripped away her arrogant parents. I had incinerated her brother's fraudulent technology company. Her fake aristocratic world was burning to the ground all around her. She was out on a temporary bail bond secured by her parents' mortgaged house, but she knew the federal prosecutors were coming for her. She knew she was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for money laundering and corporate fraud. She had no safety net left. So she decided to do what selfish people always do. She decided to run. I was sitting in my corporate office looking over the morning financial reports when my lawyer Kendrick walked in. He did not even bother to sit down. He stood in the doorway with a dark, satisfied smile on his face. He told me that our private security team had just tracked Brittany entering the main downtown branch of First Sterling Continental. It is the most exclusive bank in the city, the kind of institution where you need a minimum of $5 million in liquid assets just to open a basic checking account. Brittany had been using my stolen corporate funds to maintain a VIP account there for the past 8 months. She thought she could just stroll into the bank, pull out her black corporate credit card, and buy her way out of a federal indictment. She marched right past the regular teller lines and demanded to be let into the private wealth management lounge on the second floor. She was wearing a massive pair of dark designer sunglasses and a silk trench coat, hoping to go unrecognized. She sat down in a plush leather chair across from the senior branch manager. She slapped the heavy black corporate credit card onto the polished mahogany desk. She demanded an immediate wire transfer of $250,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. She also demanded that the bank concierge service purchase her a one-way first-class airplane ticket to Dubai, leaving that exact same afternoon. Dubai does not have a standard extradition treaty with the United States. She was actively trying to flee the country and abandon her husband in a federal holding cell. But Brittany did not realize that I had already anticipated her cowardly escape plan. 2 days ago, Kendrick had personally hand-delivered a massive stack of federal injunctions to the executive board of First Sterling Continental. The bank executives knew exactly who I was, and they knew that the accounts Brittany was trying to access were the subject of a massive federal criminal investigation. I had given the bank manager very specific instructions on how to handle my daughter-in-law if she ever dared to show her face in their building again. The branch manager picked up the black credit card. She did not smile. She did not offer Brittany a glass of expensive sparkling water like she usually did. She simply looked at her computer screen and typed in the account number. The entire terminal immediately flashed with bright red security warnings. The system locked down instantly. The manager looked at Brittany with absolute professional coldness. She informed my daughter-in-law that the transaction could not be completed. Brittany immediately lost her temper. She slammed her hands on the mahogany desk. She raised her voice, demanding to know why a simple wire transfer was taking so long. She played her favorite game. She asked the manager if she knew who she was dealing with. She threatened to close all her accounts and have the manager fired by the end of the day. She acted like a wealthy elite being inconvenienced by a lazy servant. The bank manager did not flinch. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy pair of steel shears. Right in front of Brittany's terrified eyes, the manager took the exclusive black corporate credit card and cut it directly in half. The heavy metallic snap echoed in the quiet, luxury lounge. The manager placed the broken pieces of the card onto the desk. She informed Brittany that the account had been seized by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. She stated that the bank was legally obligated to confiscate any financial instruments tied to the frozen corporate assets. But the manager did not stop there. She looked Brittany dead in the eye and informed her that attempting to wire funds from a frozen federal account while out on a criminal bail bond was a severe felony violation. The manager calmly pressed the silent security alarm located under her desk. She told Brittany that the local authorities and the federal marshals had already been notified of her presence in the building. The color completely drained from Brittany's face. The arrogant, entitled country club princess suddenly realized she had just walked directly into a massive legal trap. She was not a wealthy client commanding a bank manager. She was a desperate fugitive who had just handed the federal government another felony charge on a silver platter. Through the thick glass windows of the bank lounge, Brittany could hear the faint but rapidly approaching wail of police sirens echoing through the downtown financial district. The sound sent her into an absolute panic. She grabbed her expensive designer handbag and stumbled backward, knocking over her leather chair. She did not wait for the elevator. She ran toward the emergency stairwell, her high heels clicking frantically against the concrete steps. She sprinted out the back service exit of the bank and disappeared into the busy downtown crowds just minutes before the police cruisers swarmed the main entrance. She was officially running from the law. She had violated her bail conditions, and the federal marshals would be hunting her down before sunset. But a toxic, cornered animal always tries to find a human shield. About an hour after she fled the bank, Kendrick walked back into my office carrying a small digital audio player. Since Terrell was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, every single phone call he made or received was legally recorded by the government. Kendrick had strong connections with the district attorney, and he had managed to secure a copy of a phone call Terrell had received just 20 minutes ago. Kendrick placed the audio player on my desk and pressed play. The sound of Brittany's hysterical sobbing filled my quiet office. She had called her husband from a burner phone in a dirty alleyway. She did not call to comfort him. She did not call to figure out a legal strategy together. She called to throw him directly under the bus. Through the audio recording, I heard her begging and screaming at my son. She told Terrell that the federal agents were coming for her. She told him that her parents were going to lose their house if she went to prison. And then she made the most disgusting, manipulative demand I had ever heard in my entire life. She ordered Terrell to confess to absolutely everything. She told him to call the federal prosecutors and swear that he was the sole mastermind behind the entire corporate embezzlement scheme. She demanded that he tell the authorities he had forced her to sign the fake vendor contracts and that she had absolutely no idea the money was stolen. She was actively demanding that my son take a 20-year prison sentence so she could walk away completely clean. I listened to Terrell's voice on the recording. He sounded completely broken. He asked her how she could possibly ask him to do that. He reminded her that they were supposed to be a team. He reminded her that he had alienated his own father to give her the luxury lifestyle she demanded. Brittany's response was absolutely chilling. Her sobbing stopped instantly and her voice turned into pure venom. She told him that if he really loved her, he would take the fall. She said he was a weak, useless man and that taking the blame was the only valuable thing he could ever do for her. She promised him that if he did not confess to the federal agents by the end of the day, she would immediately file for divorce and testify against him in court. She told him she would make sure he rotted in a federal cage while she found a real man to take care of her. The recording ended with a loud click as she hung up the phone, leaving Terrell completely alone with the devastating reality of his life choices. Kendrick turned off the audio player and looked at me. The silence in my corporate office was incredibly heavy. My son had thrown a glass of wine in my face to impress a woman who was now completely willing to let him die in a concrete box just to save her own skin. Terrell was finally seeing the absolute monster he had married. His entire fake world was completely shattered. He had no money, he had no power, he had no father, and now he knew he had no wife. The ultimate psychological destruction of my cowardly son was completely finalized, but I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Terrell was going to break. And when he broke, he was going to try to drag her down into the darkness with him. The real bloodbath was just about to begin. I stood in the dark observation room of the federal building looking through the thick pane of one-way glass. The room on the other side was sterile, cold, and completely unforgiving. There was a metal table bolted to the concrete floor and two uncomfortable steel chairs. Sitting in one of those chairs was my 40-year-old son. Terrell was still wearing the same expensive tailored suit he had worn to the Easter dinner, but it was entirely ruined now. The fabric was deeply wrinkled, stained with sweat, and reeked of the holding cell he had slept in. He looked completely exhausted, but I could still see a faint glimmer of arrogant denial in his eyes. He still honestly believed that his expensive lawyers or his country club wife would walk through that door and pull him out of this nightmare. He had absolutely no idea that the nightmare was just about to reach its absolute peak. Detective Miller stood beside me in the dark with his arms crossed over his chest. He turned to me and spoke in a low, quiet voice. "The federal marshals caught Brittany 3 hours ago, Desmond," he said. "She did not make it to Dubai. They intercepted her at a private airstrip just outside the county limits trying to charter a small jet with a bag full of stolen jewelry. And you will never guess what she did the absolute second the steel cuffs clicked around her wrists. She did not ask for a phone call to her parents. She did not ask for her high-priced defense attorney. She asked for the federal prosecutor. She sat down in an interview room and she sang like a canary. I kept my eyes locked on Terrell through the glass. I felt no surprise. Toxic people have absolutely no loyalty to anyone but themselves. When the ship goes down, the rats will always step on each other to keep their heads above the water. Detective Miller tapped the glass. "Watch this," he said. "This is going to break him completely in half." 2 federal agents walked into the interrogation room carrying a silver laptop and a thick stack of printed transcripts. They did not sit down. They did not offer Terrell a glass of water. They simply opened the laptop, placed it on the metal table, and turned the screen so it was facing my son perfectly. Terrell looked up at the agents with a tired, annoyed expression. "Listen," he said, his voice muffled but clear through the audio speakers in the observation room. "I am not saying another word until my wife gets here. We have joint legal representation. You are wasting your time." The lead agent did not argue. He simply reached out and pressed the play button on the laptop keyboard. Brittany's voice filled the small concrete room. It was an official audio recording of the sworn statement she had given to the federal prosecutors just 1 hour ago. But it was not the arrogant, demanding voice of the woman who had thrown a glass of red wine into my face. It was the trembling, fragile voice of a terrified victim playing the performance of her entire life. I did not know what he was doing. She wept through the laptop speakers, her fake sobs echoing off the concrete walls. Terrell controlled absolutely everything. He was a tyrant in our house. He handled all the corporate finances and he kept me completely in the dark. He would just put these dense legal contracts in front of me and demand that I sign them. When I tried to ask questions about the consulting firms or where the money was going, he would get so angry. He threatened to cut me off. He threatened to leave me with absolutely nothing. I was so incredibly scared of him. I watched Terrell's face as the audio played. The transformation was violently immediate. The color completely washed out of his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw dropped open and his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. He stared at the silver laptop as if a venomous snake had just crawled out of the screen. The recording continued mercilessly. He hated his father, she sobbed, spinning a web of absolute poisonous lies to save her own skin. Terrell despised Desmond. He told me that the old man was ruining the logistics company and that he deserved to be completely stripped of his assets. I begged him to stop taking the money. I begged him to leave the corporate accounts alone, but he would not listen. He orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme by himself. He forced me to be a board member on those shell companies so he could use my name to hide his stolen money. I am just a victim of his massive financial manipulation. Please, you have to believe me. He is the mastermind. I had nothing to do with this. The federal agent reached out and pressed the pause button. The sudden silence in the interrogation room was incredibly heavy. It was the suffocating silence of a man's entire universe violently imploding right in front of his eyes. Terrell could not breathe. He grabbed the edges of the metal table, his knuckles turning completely white. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air like a drowning man. The woman he worshipped, the woman he had alienated his own father for the woman who he thought was his partner in this grand aristocratic life, had just thrown him directly under the heaviest bus she could find. She had painted him as a predatory, abusive mastermind and offered him up to the federal government on a silver platter to guarantee her own immunity. I watched him crumble. The psychological destruction was absolute. He remembered the Easter dinner. He remembered sitting at the head of the table blaming me for the company failures while she laughed. He remembered her throwing the dark red wine onto my chest, the shirt my late wife Yvonne had bought for me. He thought they were a team. He thought her cruelty toward me was a sign of her loyalty to him. But cruelty is never loyal. Cruelty is a loaded weapon, and the second Brittany ran out of targets, she turned the barrel directly against his head. He dropped his head onto the cold metal table and began to sob. It was not the angry, frustrated crying of a caught criminal. It was the deep, guttural weeping of a man whose very soul had been completely ripped out of his chest. He sobbed so hard, his shoulders shook violently against his ruined, tailored suit. He had absolutely no one left. He had burned the bridge to his father to build a castle with his wife, and now his wife had locked him in the dungeon and set the entire castle on fire. The federal agent stood perfectly still, letting the sheer gravity of the betrayal crush the remaining fight out of him. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were breaking his spirit into tiny, irreparable pieces so they could mold his confession. Terrell slowly lifted his head. His face was a terrible mess of sweat and tears. The deep sorrow in his eyes suddenly shifted, hardening into a desperate, burning rage. If he was going down, he was going to make absolutely sure the woman who betrayed him drowned in the exact same water. She is lying. He choked out his voice, raw and raspy. She is a lying, manipulative sociopath. She orchestrated the shell companies to pay off her brother. She is the one who forged the vendor invoices. I can prove it. I can prove all of it. The lead agent pulled a notepad from his jacket. "We are listening, Terrell," the agent said coldly. "But you are going to need to give us something massive if you want us to reconsider her immunity deal." Terrell wiped his wet face with his trembling hands. He looked up at the one-way mirror. He could not see me standing in the dark observation room, but deep down he knew I was there. He knew the architect of this entire operation was watching his downfall. "I want to talk to my father," Terrell said, staring directly into the glass. The agents exchanged a brief look, but Terrell did not wait for their approval. He leaned closer to the mirror. "Dad, if you are back there, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice echoing with absolute desperate urgency. "I know you want to destroy her. I know she ruined everything. But the federal accountants do not have the full picture yet. Brittany has a hidden offshore slush fund. She bought commercial real estate under a different maiden name in the Caribbean, completely off the books. Millions of dollars stolen directly from your company that the FBI has not found yet. Let me talk to you, Dad. Let me give you the exact account numbers. I will give you everything you need to lock her away for the rest of her natural life. Just please come in here and talk to me." I stood in the dark observation room, letting his desperate plea wash over me. He was offering me the final piece of the puzzle. He was offering to hand over the hidden millions to buy a shred of my mercy. Detective Miller turned to me. "Well," Desmond the detective said quietly, "do you want to go in there and hear what your son has to say?" I adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke suit. I looked at the broken, weeping man on the other side of the glass. The rage and the sorrow had completely settled, leaving only cold, absolute clarity. "Open the door, detective," I said softly. "I think it is time I had a final board meeting with my former chief executive officer." I stepped through the heavy steel door of the federal interrogation room. The air inside was incredibly stale, smelling of cheap floor cleaner and profound, absolute regret. The two federal agents who had been standing guard quietly stepped outside, closing the heavy door behind them with a solid metallic thud. I was left completely alone with the man who used to be my son. Terrell looked absolutely pathetic. He was hunched over a cold metal table, his hand shackled to a thick steel ring bolted securely to the floor. The arrogant chief executive officer who had slammed his fist on my custom mahogany dining table just 48 hours ago was entirely gone. In his place sat a broken, trembling boy. His expensive tailored suit was completely ruined. The fabric was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat from spending the night in a filthy holding cell. His face was swollen and his eyes were bloodshot from hours of uninterrupted crying. When he saw me sit down in the cold steel chair across from him, he immediately started weeping again. "Dad," he choked out, his voice cracking under the massive weight of his own monumental failures. "You came. I knew you would come. I knew you would not just leave me in here to rot in a concrete box." He leaned forward, pulling desperately against his metal chains. The steel clanked loudly against the table. "Dad, you have to believe me," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I was completely manipulated. Brittany poisoned my mind. She isolated me from you. She made me feel like I was never enough, like I had to steal that corporate money just to keep up with her wealthy family and their country club lifestyle. She orchestrated the shell companies. She told me it was the only way to modernize the business and survive the current market. I was just trying to keep my marriage together. She brainwashed me, Dad. She is a monster, and I am just her victim." I sat perfectly still. I did not reach out across the table to comfort him. I did not offer him a single ounce of a father's warmth or reassurance. I just stared at him, letting his pathetic, cowardly excuses hang in the sterile air of the interrogation room. "You think this is about her?" I asked. My voice was dangerously low and completely devoid of any emotion. "You think I am sitting in this federal building right now because I care about the lies your toxic wife fed you?" Terrell blinked rapidly, his face wet with tears. "But the offshore accounts—" "Dad," he stammered, desperate to offer me a trade. "I can give you the account numbers. I can give you the exact locations of the commercial real estate she bought in the Caribbean, completely off the books. If I give you everything, you can talk to the federal prosecutor, right? You can hire the best defense attorneys in the state and get me a reduced sentence. We can destroy her together, Dad. We can fix this." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold metal table. I looked deeply into his bloodshot eyes, searching for any lingering trace of the strong, honorable man his mother and I had sacrificed everything to raise. I searched for a man who understood accountability. I found absolutely nothing. "You have been a coward since the day you were born, Terrell," I said. My words cut through the quiet room like a serrated surgical blade. "You always took the easy way out. You always let other people fight your battles for you. And when things got incredibly difficult, you always looked around for someone else to blame for your own actions." Terrell flinched hard, as if I had physically struck him across the face. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic whimper. "I am not finished." I commanded, silencing him instantly. "You sit in this federal cage, and you blame Brittany for your massive financial crimes. But Brittany did not force you to sign those fraudulent vendor contracts. Brittany did not force you to fire loyal truck drivers who had young families to feed just so you could buy a luxury vacation home. And Brittany certainly did not force you to sit at the head of my dining table, look me dead in the eye, and call me useless." I watched the deep, overwhelming shame wash over his face, making him look physically ill, but I refused to stop. He needed to hear the absolute truth before I walked out of his life forever. "That glass of dark red wine your wife threw in my face did not hurt me, Terrell." I continued, my voice echoing with absolute, unbreakable authority. "It ruined a beautiful linen shirt your late mother bought for me, but the wine itself did not cause me any pain. What hurt me was watching my own flesh and blood sit silently in his chair and watch it happen. What hurt was watching you look away because you were too much of a coward to defend your own father in his own house. Dad, I am so sorry." He sobbed, completely collapsing forward onto the metal table, burying his face in his shackled hands. "I am so sorry." I stood up, pushing my steel chair back. The harsh scraping sound echoed off the concrete walls. "You offered me the offshore account numbers to buy my mercy," I said, looking down at his trembling shoulders. "The federal agents are waiting just outside that door with a pen and a legal pad. You are going to give them every single detailed record about Brittany's hidden millions because cooperating with the government is the absolute only leverage you have left in this world. But do not ever confuse your cooperation with my forgiveness." I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy steel door. "Dad, wait!" Terrell screamed, pulling violently against his metal chains. "Where are you going? You have to help me get out of here. You cannot just leave me." I stopped and turned around, looking at him one last time. I wanted to remember this exact image of him so I would never be tempted to look back. "I did not come here to save you, Terrell," I stated with absolute, chilling finality. "I came here to watch you pay the price." I knocked twice on the heavy door and the agents opened it immediately. I walked out of the interrogation room, leaving the desperate, echoing sobs of my former son locked securely behind a solid steel barrier. I walked down the long, sterile hallway of the federal courthouse, feeling a profound, incredible sense of closure. The rot had been completely excised from my life. The infection was officially gone. I stepped out through the grand front doors of the courthouse into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. My lawyer, Kendrick, was leaning against the side of my black SUV, holding his secure phone to his ear. When he saw me approaching, he quickly ended his call and tucked the phone into his tailored suit pocket. A sharp, highly predatory smile spread across his face. "How did the board meeting go?" Kendrick asked, extending his hand to offer me a thick manila folder. "He is fully cooperating with the federal prosecutors," I replied, taking the folder and sliding into the back seat of the vehicle. "He is going to hand them every single offshore account Brittany tried to hide. He honestly thinks it will save him, but he is looking at a decade behind bars regardless of his cooperation." "What do you have for me?" Kendrick climbed into the seat beside me and let out a low, dark chuckle. "It seems Brittany's parents are panicking Desmond. Richard and Susan are completely terrified. They put up their own country club estate as collateral to secure Brittany's temporary bail bond. But now that she tried to flee the country on a private jet, the federal judge has permanently revoked her bail. The bail bondsman is actively moving to seize their property to cover the massive financial loss. They are entirely bankrupt and desperate for fast cash." I opened the folder resting on my lap. Inside were several printed screenshots of a high-end luxury real estate listing. It was an active listing for a sprawling suburban mansion. My mansion. The exact house where they had hosted that disastrous Easter dinner and thrown wine in my face. "They are trying to sell the house," I said, staring at the glossy photographs of my own living room and custom kitchen. "Exactly." Kendrick smiled, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. In their sheer absolute desperation, they contacted a luxury real estate broker early this morning. They are trying to quickly liquidate the mansion to pay off the ruthless bail bondsman and secure a top-tier defense attorney for their precious daughter. Richard is walking around telling the brokers that the house belongs to his son-in-law and that he has the legal family authority to sell it to cover their emergency expenses. I looked at the listing price. They were trying to sell my multi-million-dollar property for a quick, massive cash buyout. The sheer audacity of these arrogant people was simply boundless. They had absolutely no idea how commercial trusts operated. They had no idea that Terrell's name was nowhere near the actual property deed. "They do not know who really owns the house," I murmured, closing the folder with a highly satisfying snap. "They have absolutely no clue," Desmond Kendrick confirmed. "They think they are about to walk away with millions in clean cash. They are hosting a massive open house and a public estate sale tomorrow afternoon to liquidate the expensive furniture and lock in a wealthy cash buyer." I looked at my lawyer, feeling the familiar thrill of the hunt ignite my blood all over again. "Tell the driver to get the car ready, Kendrick," I said, leaning back against the leather seat. "I think it is time we attend a luxury open house and give Richard the brutal real estate education he so desperately needs." The afternoon sun was shining brightly over the upscale suburban neighborhood as my black vehicle pulled onto the familiar street. It was a beautiful day for an absolute massacre. As my driver navigated toward the massive iron gates of the estate, I looked out the window and saw a sickening display of pure upper-class desperation. The street was lined with expensive luxury cars. Bright red signs were planted in the manicured grass reading exclusive estate sale and open house. Richard and Susan, the arrogant parents of my criminal daughter-in-law, were throwing a fire sale. They had permanently lost their own country club mansion to the ruthless bail bondsman when Brittany tried to flee the country. Now they were entirely homeless, completely bankrupt, and desperate for fast cash. They thought they had found the perfect loophole. They assumed that because their daughter was married to my son, the sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion he lived in was a marital asset. They assumed they could just hire a luxury real estate broker, invite their wealthy friends over, and liquidate my entire property to save their own pathetic skins. They were inside my house right now, putting price tags on my custom furniture and accepting cash offers for the very roof I had paid for. I stepped out of the vehicle and buttoned my bespoke suit jacket. My lawyer, Kendrick, stepped out right behind me holding his heavy black leather briefcase. We walked up the wide concrete driveway, completely ignoring the chaotic crowd of wealthy bargain hunters carrying out expensive lamps and imported rugs. I felt a cold, deep anger burning in my chest, but my face remained an absolute mask of stone. The front doors were wide open. We walked right into the grand foyer. The scene inside was completely disgusting. Susan was standing near the sweeping staircase wearing a designer dress and a forced fake smile, holding a clipboard. She was haggling with a neighborhood wife over the price of a vintage crystal chandelier. Richard was standing in the center of the living room holding a glass of sparkling water. He was talking loudly to a local real estate broker and a wealthy couple who were looking to buy the estate. Richard was acting like the proud patriarch, showing off the high ceilings and the custom hardwood floors as if he had built the house with his own 2 hands. I did not clear my throat. I did not announce my presence. I simply walked into the center of the living room and stood directly behind Richard. Kendrick stood right beside me. The wealthy couple, noticing my dark tailored suit and my uncompromising posture, immediately stopped talking. The real estate broker looked confused. Richard turned around slowly, annoyed that his grand sales pitch had been interrupted. When he saw me standing there, the fake aristocratic smile completely vanished from his face. His skin turned a pale, sickly shade of gray, but his toxic country club entitlement refused to let him back down in front of potential buyers. "What are you doing here, Desmond?" Richard demanded, lowering his voice into a harsh whisper. "This is a private estate sale. You have absolutely no right to be on this property. I am asking you to turn around and walk out that door right now before I call the private security to escort you off the premises." I looked at him with profound, absolute pity. "You are selling my house, Richard," I said calmly, my deep voice carrying across the quiet living room. Richard let out a short, arrogant laugh, puffing out his chest. "This is not your house, old man," he sneered, stepping closer to me. "This house belongs to my son-in-law Terrell and my daughter Brittany, and since they are currently indisposed, fighting the ridiculous false charges you completely fabricated, I have been granted the family authority to liquidate their assets. We have already accepted a cash offer of $4 million for the property. The paperwork is being drafted right now. You are entirely powerless here. You are just a bitter old dinosaur who cannot stand the fact that we outsmarted you." I did not argue with him. I simply turned my head and looked at the luxury real estate broker who was standing nervously nearby, holding a stack of glossy marketing brochures. "Are you the listing agent for this property?" I asked the broker. The man nodded eagerly, adjusting his expensive tie. "Yes, sir, I am," he replied. "We are moving very quickly on this estate. Mr. Richard here signed the exclusive brokerage agreement just this morning." I looked back at Richard. He was smiling a smug, victorious smile. He honestly believed he had just legally stolen $4 million from me. He thought he was walking away a rich man. "Kendrick," I said quietly, "please educate this gentleman on commercial property law." My lawyer stepped forward. He placed his heavy black briefcase onto a nearby marble table and popped the golden clasps. The metallic sound echoed sharply in the large room. Kendrick pulled out a thick stack of watermarked legal documents bearing the heavy blue seal of the county clerk. Mr. Richard Kendrick began, his voice echoing with cold, clinical authority. "You just stated in front of multiple witnesses that you signed an exclusive brokerage agreement to sell this estate. You stated that the property belongs to Terrell and Brittany. I am afraid you have made a catastrophic legal error." Richard crossed his arms, trying to look unbothered, but I could see a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Kendrick held up the first document for the real estate broker to see. "This house was never purchased by Terrell Crawford," the lawyer announced loudly, ensuring that every single person in the room could hear the truth. "It was purchased in cash 7 years ago by Desmond Crawford, and upon purchase, it was immediately transferred into the Yvonne Crawford Irrevocable Living Trust." Susan dropped her clipboard. It clattered loudly against the floor. "The sole trustee and absolute legal owner of this entire estate is Mr. Desmond Crawford, standing right here," Kendrick continued, his voice rising. "Terrell was merely listed as a conditional tenant. His name is absolutely nowhere on the deed. Brittany has zero legal claim to this property. And you, Richard, have just attempted to sell a multi-million-dollar commercial asset that does not belong to you." The real estate broker turned completely white. He snatched the document from Kendrick's hand and read the official deed. His eyes widened in sheer absolute horror. He looked at Richard as if the man was covered in a highly contagious disease. "You signed a binding legal contract claiming you had the right to sell this house," the broker shouted at Richard, his voice cracking with panic. "You lied to me. You involved my brokerage in a massive federal crime. It is called wire fraud and real estate fraud," Kendrick clarified, perfectly calm. "By attempting to execute a fraudulent sale across state banking lines to secure a $4 million cash payout, you have just committed a Class B federal felony. We have already notified the district attorney. The local authorities have been dispatched to this location to process the fraudulent contracts you signed. The absolute destruction of Richard and Susan was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The arrogant country club elites who had looked down on my family for years suddenly realized they had just walked blindly into a federal trap of their own making. The wealthy neighbors and the bargain hunters who had been browsing the furniture immediately dropped the items they were holding. They realized they were standing in the middle of an active crime scene buying stolen goods from fraudulent squatters. They rushed out the front doors in an absolute panic, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. The real estate broker threw the glossy brochures onto the floor. "I am voiding this contract immediately," the broker yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Richard. "You are a complete fraud. I am calling my legal team." The broker stormed out of the house, leaving Richard and Susan completely alone in the center of the massive living room. The grand estate sale was officially over. Richard was hyperventilating. His chest heaved as he looked around the empty room. His fake aristocratic world was completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He had no money. He had no country club estate. His daughter was locked in a federal cage facing decades in prison. And now he and his wife were facing their own massive felony indictments. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice completely devoid of any pity. "Desmond, please." Susan wept, falling to her knees on the imported rug. "Where are we supposed to go? We have absolutely nothing left. We do not have a car. We do not have a bank account. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. You sat at my dining table and laughed when your daughter threw a glass of wine into my face," I reminded her, my eyes cold and unforgiving. "You thought my silence was weakness. You thought you could completely erase me and steal my legacy. I am taking my legacy back. You have exactly 2 minutes to walk out those front doors before I have my private security drag you out by your expensive collars." Richard and Susan did not argue. They were completely broken. They slowly stood up and walked out of the grand foyer empty-handed. They walked down the long concrete driveway completely humiliated as their wealthy former friends watched them from the street. They were officially homeless, entirely bankrupt, and waiting for the federal marshals to come for them. I stood in the quiet living room, feeling a profound sense of absolute order being restored. The house was finally mine again. But as I looked around the empty room, I knew the cleansing was not entirely finished. Brittany had lived in this house for 3 years. Toxic, greedy people like her always keep secrets. They always build a hidden nest egg just in case their fragile world collapses. I turned to Kendrick and told him to call the demolition crew. It was time to tear up the hardwood floors in the master bedroom and see exactly what my daughter-in-law had buried beneath my feet. I stood in the doorway of the massive master suite on the second floor of my home. This sprawling room used to be my son's sanctuary. It was the room he shared with the arrogant woman who had thrown a glass of dark red wine right into my face. The air in the room still smelled faintly of her expensive artificial perfume and his overpriced cologne. I could not stand the scent of it. I could not stand looking at the ridiculous modern furniture and the ugly imported rugs they had used to cover up the beautiful classic architecture my late wife Yvonne and I had originally chosen. I wanted every single physical trace of their toxic existence completely eradicated from my property. I hired a private demolition crew to come in first thing Monday morning. I stood in the hallway and gave the foreman very specific and ruthless instructions. I told him I wanted the entire master suite stripped down to the absolute bare studs. I wanted the custom walk-in closets completely demolished. I wanted the imported French hardwood floors ripped up and thrown directly into a commercial dumpster. I did not care about the noise or the dust. The sound of heavy sledgehammers and steel crowbars echoing through the high ceilings of my house was incredibly therapeutic to me. It was the sound of a deep, poisonous infection being surgically removed from the body of my home. I was sitting downstairs in the kitchen drinking a cup of strong black coffee when the demolition foreman walked in. He wiped a thick layer of white drywall dust from his forehead and looked at me with a very serious expression. He did not speak right away. He just shook his head and said they had found something highly unusual up there. He said I needed to come upstairs and look at it myself before they proceeded with any further demolition. I put down my coffee mug and followed him up the grand sweeping staircase. The master suite was completely covered in dust and splintered wood. The foreman led me to a section of the floor in the far back corner of Brittany's massive walk-in closet. The heavy oak floorboards had been carefully pried up, revealing a dark rectangular hollow space hidden deep between the thick wooden floor joists. Resting silently inside that dark cavity was a heavy solid steel biometric floor safe. I looked down at the cold metal box and a dark, knowing smile spread across my face. My son Terrell had absolutely no idea this safe existed. If he had known about it, he would have eagerly offered it to the federal agents during his pathetic weeping interrogation, just to save his own skin. This was Brittany's ultimate private secret. A truly toxic, parasitic person never fully trusts anyone in their life. Not even the weak husband they actively manipulate. They always build a hidden nest egg. They always construct a secret escape hatch just in case their fragile house of cards completely collapses. She had been quietly siphoning the money she helped steal from my corporate accounts and hiding it right beneath my feet. I called my private security team immediately. I told my security chief to bring up an industrial power drill and a heavy diamond blade angle grinder. I did not care about preserving the locking mechanism. I wanted the safe opened right then and there. It took my security chief 20 minutes of loud, aggressive grinding through the thick, reinforced steel to finally pop the heavy internal hinges. Sparks flew across the dusty closet as the metal finally gave way. When the heavy steel door was pried open, the absolute magnitude of her sheer greed was staring me right in the face. The dark safe was packed entirely to the brim. There were neat, thick stacks of $100 bills wrapped tightly in thick rubber bands. It was easily hundreds of thousands of dollars in completely untraceable cash. Stacked right next to the cash were several sleek, black velvet jewelry boxes. I opened them one by one. I found heavy diamond necklaces, thick platinum tennis bracelets, and several solid gold watches. These were not old family heirlooms. These were highly liquid, expensive assets purchased strictly with stolen corporate funds. It was a classic, untraceable money laundering tactic. She had bought expensive jewelry so she could easily pawn it for fast cash or quietly smuggle it across an international border if the federal authorities ever came knocking at her door. She had planned her cowardly escape route perfectly. She just never expected the old man she mocked to completely tear up the floorboards. A lesser man might have quietly taken the cash. A lesser man might have used those hidden funds to recoup the massive financial losses she inflicted on his logistics company. But I am Desmond Crawford. I did not build a multi-million-dollar empire by cutting dark corners or hiding dirty money in the shadows. I built my fortune in the bright light of honest, backbreaking work. I pulled out my smartphone and dialed the direct line of the lead Internal Revenue Service investigator handling the federal case against my son and his wife. I told the federal agent that my demolition crew had just uncovered a massive cache of hidden stolen assets buried deep inside my property. Within 30 minutes, 2 black government tactical vehicles pulled swiftly into my driveway. The federal agents walked up the grand staircase, carrying heavy plastic evidence bags and high-definition digital cameras. I stood in the doorway of the ruined closet and watched as the agents meticulously cataloged every single stack of $100 bills and every single diamond necklace. The lead agent looked at me and shook his head in absolute profound disbelief. He told me that this discovery completely changed the entire trajectory of the federal prosecution. Brittany was already facing decades in prison for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, but deliberately hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in a secret biometric floor safe elevated her crimes to a completely different federal level. The agent explained that she would now be officially charged with the felony concealment of assets tax evasion and the direct obstruction of an active federal investigation. This was the absolute final nail in her coffin. She had dug her own grave in my floorboards and I had just buried her in it. The agent sealed the evidence bags and carried her secret escape fund right out the front doors. News travels incredibly fast when you are dealing with desperate, bankrupt people. Brittany's expensive defense attorney received the official notification from the federal prosecutor later that exact same afternoon. The concealed assets had been legally seized. When Brittany heard the news, she completely unraveled. She was currently sitting in a cheap, filthy motel room, completely bankrupt and entirely alone. Her arrogant parents were homeless. Her tech bro brother was financially ruined. Her weak husband was locked in a federal holding cell actively testifying against her. And now her secret stash of cash and diamonds, her absolute last lifeline in the entire world, was sitting permanently in a federal evidence locker. She had no money to pay her high-priced lawyers. She had no money to run away. She was backed into a dark concrete corner with absolutely no way out. But a toxic, entitled narcissist never simply surrenders to reality. When they are stripped of their stolen money, their fake power, and their enabling allies, they always reach for the absolute cheapest weapon available to them. They reach for unearned public sympathy. Brittany realized she could not possibly win in a federal courtroom. The financial paper trail was far too thick, and the physical evidence was completely undeniable. So she decided to try and win her freedom in the court of public opinion. She decided to use the current social climate and racial dynamics to her absolute advantage. She picked up her smartphone and opened her social media accounts. She set up her camera in the dim lighting of her cheap motel room. She deliberately messed up her blonde hair and smeared her expensive mascara to make herself look like a terrified, completely broken victim. She hit the record button and began to weave the most disgusting, manipulative public lie she had ever told in her entire life. She was going to play the ultimate victim card. She was preparing to tell the entire internet that she was a helpless, innocent white woman being ruthlessly hunted and financially oppressed by her tyrannical, vindictive, and incredibly powerful black father-in-law. She was about to start a massive digital fire, hoping the public outrage would burn me to the ground. But she had absolutely no idea that I controlled the rain, and the storm was just getting started. I have seen many forms of desperation in my 73 years of life, but there is a very specific type of poison that flows through the veins of modern society. It is the absolute weaponization of victimhood. Brittany realized that her hidden floor safe had been seized by federal agents and her legal options were completely exhausted. She had no money and no power left in the real world. So she turned to the digital world. She retreated to her cheap motel room, set up her smartphone camera, and recorded a highly manipulated video. I sat in my downtown corporate office and watched the footage play on my laptop screen. She was a phenomenal actress. She wore a plain gray sweater to look humble and destitute. She had deliberately ruined her eye makeup, making dark tear streaks run down her pale cheeks. She looked directly into the camera and told the internet a completely fabricated story of survival. She claimed that she and my son Terrell were victims of a tyrannical, abusive billionaire. She painted me as an aggressive, oppressive black patriarch who used his massive wealth to crush anyone who disagreed with him. She wept openly, claiming that the corporate funds were just a simple accounting error that I blew out of proportion because I hated her. She actually said I targeted her because she was a white woman from a good family and I wanted to destroy her aristocratic background out of pure spite. Within hours, the video went completely viral. The internet is a hungry beast that loves to consume outrage without ever checking the facts. Millions of people watched her fake tears and immediately grabbed their digital pitchforks. My corporate headquarters was flooded with angry phone calls. Strangers were leaving hateful comments on the Crawford Logistics website calling for boycotts and federal investigations into my business practices. News anchors on the local evening broadcasts started running segments about the wealthy logistics titan who sent his own son to a federal holding cell over a family dispute. My lawyer, Kendrick, walked into my office, pacing back and forth across the carpet. He was sweating and checking his phone every 5 seconds. He told me we needed to issue a massive public relations statement immediately. He wanted to draft a highly sterilized corporate apology and release the financial documents to prove her guilt. He said the public perception was turning against us, and the company stock was going to take a massive hit by Monday morning. I sat in my leather executive chair and took a slow sip of my black coffee. I told Kendrick to put his phone away and sit down. I explained to my lawyer that arguing with the internet is like trying to punch the ocean. You just end up exhausting yourself while the water remains completely unchanged. When a toxic person builds a massive public lie, you do not fight them with paper statements. You let them climb all the way to the very top of their fragile pedestal, and then you simply remove the pillar supporting it. I asked Kendrick a very simple question. I asked him if he remembered that I had upgraded the internal security system of my suburban mansion 3 years ago. I had installed high-definition cameras with crystal-clear audio microphones in all the common areas to monitor the estate when I was traveling for business. One of those cameras was positioned perfectly in the upper corner of the grand formal dining room. I opened a secure folder on my laptop and clicked on a video file. I turned the screen so Kendrick could see it. It was the raw, unedited security footage from Easter Sunday. Kendrick watched the screen in absolute silence. He saw Terrell sitting at the head of my table, acting like an arrogant king. He heard the crystal-clear audio of my son slamming his fist down and screaming that I was completely useless. He watched Brittany let out that cold, cruel laugh. He watched her pick up her heavy crystal glass and maliciously throw the dark red wine directly into the face of a 73-year-old man. He saw the wine soak into the blue linen shirt my late wife Yvonne had bought for me. He saw me quietly take off my glasses, wipe my face, and walk out of the room with absolute quiet dignity while her white aristocratic family smirked and laughed at my humiliation. Kendrick's jaw tightened. The anger in his eyes was cold and absolute. He asked me what I wanted to do with the footage. I did not want to post it on a random social media page where it could be buried or debated by her fake supporters. I wanted maximum undeniable exposure. I told Kendrick to contact our massive corporate advertising agency. I authorized a budget of $1 million in cash to be spent entirely within the next 4 hours. I bought every single available premium commercial slot on the local television networks during the evening news broadcasts. I bought targeted digital advertisements on every major social media platform focused heavily on the exact demographic that was currently supporting her fake victim video. I did not add any dramatic background music. I did not record a voiceover trying to defend myself. I just let the raw, unedited footage speak for itself. At exactly 7 o'clock that evening, the trap was sprung. Millions of people sitting in their living rooms watching the news or scrolling through their phones suddenly saw the screen cut to the elegant dining room of my mansion. They watched the entire brutal exchange. They heard the sheer venom in my son's voice. They saw the absolute cruelty in Brittany's eyes as she threw the wine into the face of an elderly black man who was just sitting quietly at his own dinner table. The text at the very end of the short broadcast was simple and devastating. It read, "This is the real Brittany Crawford. This is how she treats the man she stole millions from. Do not let a thief cry victim." The public backlash was instantaneous, and it was absolutely apocalyptic. The internet beast that had been fiercely defending her suddenly realized it had been completely manipulated. The wave of public outrage stopped dead in its tracks and then violently reversed direction. The comments on her viral video went from deep sympathy to pure, unadulterated disgust. People were absolutely horrified by the raw elder abuse they had just witnessed. They saw a spoiled, entitled woman assaulting a senior citizen in his own home. The local news stations immediately dropped their critical segments about me and started running the security footage on a continuous loop. The narrative shifted from a tyrannical billionaire to a heartbroken father dealing with a pair of abusive, parasitic criminals. Brittany had tried to use the court of public opinion to save her life, but the jury had just returned a unanimous verdict of total social annihilation. Her phone numbers were leaked. Her social media accounts were flooded with tens of thousands of hateful messages calling her a monster and a fraud. The few wealthy friends she had left from her country club days immediately released public statements completely distancing themselves from her. The boutique public relations firm that had briefly considered representing her issued a swift denial claiming they would never work with an elder abuser. She was entirely radioactive. She could not walk down the street without being recognized as the cruel woman who threw wine at an old man. She had dug a massive grave trying to bury my reputation, but she had accidentally thrown herself directly into the hole. She had absolutely no money, no family, no public support, and the federal prosecutors were moving in for the final kill. The stage was perfectly set for the complete destruction of her arrogant brother Chad and the final courtroom reckoning. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of stupidity. When you strip a toxic, arrogant person of their fake wealth and their unearned status, they do not suddenly learn how to work hard. They look for the absolute fastest way to steal their way back to the top. Chad was the perfect example of this pathetic reality. Just a week ago, he was a self-proclaimed Silicon Valley visionary wearing $1,000 sneakers and pitching a fake logistics startup to wealthy venture capitalists. But after I made that single phone call to his lead investor, his entire fake empire evaporated in less than 5 minutes. His bank accounts were frozen by the federal government because they were entirely funded by the money his sister Brittany had embezzled from my company. His landlord locked him out of his luxury downtown loft. His leased sports car was repossessed. He was completely broke and entirely desperate. Chad used to sit at my custom mahogany dining table and mock my life work. He called Crawford Logistics a dinosaur company. He said driving heavy freight across the country was a dead industry and that his software was going to replace people like me. But when his digital fantasy world collapsed, he suddenly realized that the physical world was the only place where real money existed. He decided that the fastest way to get his hands on $250,000 in untraceable cash was to steal one of my dinosaurs. He thought he was dealing with an out-of-touch elderly man. He assumed my corporate security was as outdated as he claimed my business model was. During the height of their embezzlement scheme, Brittany had given her brother a master vendor access card. She told him it would allow him to bypass the main security gates at our secondary freight yard on the industrial south side of the city. She did it so he could pretend to be inspecting the yard for his fake software updates. Chad kept that plastic card. He thought it was his golden ticket. Late on a rainy Tuesday night, Chad took a cheap city bus to the industrial district. He was wearing dark clothes pulled tightly up around his face, trying his absolute hardest to look like a professional criminal instead of a terrified tech bro. I know exactly what he was wearing because I was sitting comfortably in my warm corporate penthouse downtown, watching him on a high-definition security feed. What Chad failed to understand is that Crawford Logistics does not operate in the dark ages. My fleet consists of 500 state-of-the-art commercial trucks. Each 18-wheeler is a rolling fortress. They are equipped with advanced biometric scanners, high-definition night vision cameras mounted inside the cabin, and military-grade global positioning systems. I knew Chad had entered the yard the exact second he swiped that deactivated vendor card. The perimeter computer silently flagged the entry and sent a direct alert to my secure tablet. I watched the live video feed as Chad sneaked across the wet asphalt. He walked right past the older models and headed straight for a brand-new Peterbilt truck attached to a fully loaded commercial trailer. The cargo inside that trailer consisted of high-end consumer electronics bound for a distribution center across the state line. The combined value of the truck and the cargo was easily over $500,000. Chad had spent the last 3 days crawling through the dark corners of the internet, finding a black market chop shop willing to pay him a massive cash bounty for a stolen rig. He climbed up the metal steps and slipped into the driver's seat. He pulled out an electronic bypass tool he had bought online, thinking he could easily override the ignition sequence. He plugged it into the dashboard. The massive diesel engine roared to life. The heavy truck vibrated with raw physical power. I watched the camera feed inside the cabin. Chad's face was illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights. He was smiling a wide, arrogant smile. He actually thought he was a genius. He thought he had just outsmarted the billionaire dinosaur and secured his financial freedom. I did not call the local police. I did not trigger the loud alarm sirens in the freight yard. I wanted him to leave the property. I wanted him to feel the absolute intoxicating thrill of a successful heist. But most importantly, I wanted him to drive toward the highway. Stealing a commercial truck in the city is a standard felony, but driving a stolen commercial vehicle loaded with corporate cargo across a state border elevates the crime to a massive federal offense under the Interstate Commerce Act. It triggers the direct involvement of federal marshals and guarantees a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I wanted to hand Chad the absolute heaviest legal anchor I could possibly find. I sat in my leather armchair and tracked the blinking red dot on my digital map. Chad merged onto the dark, empty interstate. He was driving fast, pushing the heavy machine toward the state line. He turned up the radio in the cabin, bobbing his head to the loud music. He was celebrating a victory that did not exist. I watched him drive for 2 solid hours, letting him get further and further away from the city. I wanted him to be completely isolated. As the red dot on my screen approached the geographical border, I picked up my phone and called the Federal Highway Patrol. I identified myself as Desmond Crawford. I gave the dispatcher the exact coordinates, speed, and trajectory of my stolen commercial vehicle. I told them to position their units just 1 mile past the state line marker. I watched the live feed as the massive truck rumbled past the large reflective green sign welcoming drivers to the neighboring state. The exact second the rear tires of the commercial trailer crossed the painted borderline, the trap was officially sprung. Chad had just committed a massive federal crime. I reached down and tapped a single red icon on my secure tablet screen. The advanced telemetry system inside the truck reacted instantly. The remote satellite kill switch engaged. The massive diesel engine immediately completely died. The fuel lines locked shut. The dashboard lights went completely black. The automated safety systems gently engaged the air brakes, guiding the heavy 18-wheelers safely onto the dark gravel shoulder of the empty highway. I watched the interior camera feed as absolute sheer panic overtook Chad. The loud music abruptly cut off. The steering wheel locked rigid in his hands. He frantically turned the ignition key over and over again, but the engine was completely dead. He slapped the steering wheel, cursing loudly. He looked around the dark cabin completely terrified, realizing he was stranded on the side of a dark federal interstate in a stolen $500,000 vehicle. Then the darkness outside his window was violently shattered by blinding flashing lights. Red and blue strobes illuminated the entire cabin. Half a dozen federal highway patrol cruisers and heavy tactical vehicles surrounded the dead truck, cutting off any possible escape route. The loud, commanding voice of a federal officer echoed through a bullhorn, demanding that the driver throw the keys out the window and exit the vehicle with his hands completely empty. Chad began to weep. It was the exact same pathetic, cowardly crying his sister Brittany had displayed when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. He pushed open the heavy driver door and climbed down the metal steps. He fell onto his knees on the rough, wet asphalt, raising his trembling hands into the air. Heavily armed federal officers rushed forward, pressing him flat against the ground and aggressively securing his wrists behind his back. I watched the entire beautiful takedown from the absolute comfort of my penthouse suite. I closed the video feed on my tablet and took a slow, deep breath of the quiet air. The execution was completely flawless. Chad thought he was a brilliant disruptor, but he was just another arrogant thief walking blindly into a digital cage I had built specifically for him. Now the entire fake aristocratic family was completely decimated. The arrogant sister was locked in a federal holding cell, facing decades for money laundering. The condescending parents were entirely homeless and publicly humiliated. And the tech bro brother was officially a federal inmate charged with grand theft and interstate trafficking. They had all looked down on the elderly black man sitting at the head of the dining table. They thought I was useless. But I had just systematically dismantled their entire bloodline and sent every single one of them straight to federal prison without ever raising my voice or leaving my chair. There is a profound difference between loyalty and convenience. When you build a relationship entirely on stolen money and fake social status, the absolute second that foundation cracks, the entire structure collapses inward. I sat quietly in the back corner of a sterile conference room inside the federal courthouse. I was allowed to be there as the primary victim of their massive corporate fraud. The room smelled of cheap coffee and heavy administrative dread. The expensive mahogany table in the center of the room was covered with thick stacks of legal files, printed bank statements, and glossy photographs of the secret biometric safe my demolition crew had ripped out of their closet. Sitting on one side of the table was my 40-year-old son, Terrell. He looked completely hollow. His skin was pale, and he had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. Sitting at the far opposite end of the table was his wife, Brittany. They were intentionally keeping as much physical distance between them as the small room would allow. She was wearing a plain gray prison-issued jumpsuit that completely washed out her complexion. The arrogant country club princess who had laughed and thrown red wine in my face on Easter Sunday was entirely gone. She looked like a trapped, cornered animal, frantically searching for an exit that simply did not exist. Standing at the head of the table was the senior federal prosecutor. He was a sharp, uncompromising man who had spent 20 years sending corrupt executives to federal penitentiaries. He did not care about their country club memberships or their fake aristocratic background. He only cared about the undeniable physical evidence sitting on the table. He looked down at Terrell and Brittany with a cold, clinical expression. The prosecutor cleared his throat and laid out the absolute reality of their situation. He told them that the federal government had successfully traced every single stolen dollar. He detailed the fake vendor invoices, the shell companies in Delaware, the offshore accounts in the Caribbean, and the hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and diamonds hidden in the floorboards of my house. He explained that they were both facing multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and the obstruction of a federal investigation. If they decided to take the case to trial, the prosecutor promised he would secure a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years for each of them. The room went completely silent. Terrell stared down at his trembling hands. Brittany gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning pure white. But the federal government is focused on efficiency. The prosecutor continued, his voice flat and businesslike. He slid two identical thick legal documents across the polished table. One stopped in front of Terrell and the other stopped in front of Brittany. The prosecutor explained the terms of the global plea agreement. He offered them a severely reduced sentence. If they both signed the documents, immediately admitted full complete guilt, and officially surrendered all remaining hidden assets, the federal government would cap their prison sentences at 8 years. They would serve their time and walk out before they turned 50. But there was a massive non-negotiable catch to this offer. The prosecutor stated clearly that it was a package deal. They both had to sign it today. If one of them refused the deal, the offer was permanently revoked for both of them, and they would both face the absolute maximum penalty in front of a federal judge. The silence in the room suddenly turned incredibly volatile. The air grew thick and heavy. I watched from my chair in the corner, knowing exactly what was about to happen. You cannot put two starving, desperate predators in a cage, drop one piece of meat between them, and expect them to share it. Brittany was the first one to break. She looked at the plea agreement and then she glared at Terrell with eyes full of pure, unadulterated venom. She slammed her hand flat against the table. She loudly declared that she was absolutely not signing the document. She said she refused to spend 8 years in a concrete cell for a financial scheme that her incompetent husband had dragged her into. She pointed a shaking finger at Terrell and called him a pathetic, weak excuse for a man. She told the prosecutor that Terrell was the chief executive officer and that he should take the full 25-year sentence so she could walk away completely free. Terrell snapped his head up. The deep, overwhelming sorrow in his eyes instantly evaporated and was completely replaced by a blind, violent rage. He had spent his entire marriage bowing down to her arrogant demands, alienating his own father to buy her expensive clothes and luxury vacations. He had protected her right up until the moment she tried to throw him under the bus in the interrogation room. The absolute disrespect finally pushed him entirely over the edge. Terrell leaned across the table and screamed right back at her. He called her a toxic parasite. He told the entire room that she was the one who forced him to steal the money. He said she was completely obsessed with competing against her wealthy country club friends, and that nothing he ever bought her was enough to satisfy her massive, bottomless greed. He yelled that she was the one who hired the shady offshore accountants, and that she was the one who orchestrated the fake consulting jobs to funnel stolen corporate money directly to her tech bro brother Chad. The court-appointed defense attorneys frantically tried to intervene. They begged their clients to lower their voices and stop talking on the official record. But the dam had completely broken. The floodgates of their toxic marriage were fully open, and neither of them could stop the absolute torrent of bitter, ugly truth spilling out into the open room. Brittany laughed a harsh, hysterical sound. She mocked Terrell right in front of the federal prosecutor. She told the room that Terrell was so incredibly incompetent that he used to lock himself in his home office and cry because he did not know how to run the logistics empire his father had built. She said she had to take over the corporate finances because Terrell was too stupid to manage the vendor contracts. She completely emasculated him, stripping away every single ounce of his remaining dignity. She told him that she never actually loved him, and that she only married him because she thought he was going to inherit a massive billion-dollar empire from a dying old man. Terrell's face turned a dark, violent shade of red. He completely lost whatever small shred of self-control he had left. He leaned forward and began exposing every single dirty, hidden secret Brittany had ever told him. He told the federal prosecutor about a fake charity gala Brittany had organized 2 years ago. He revealed that she had collected over $50,000 in donations from her wealthy neighbors, supposedly for a local children's hospital, but she had secretly pocketed the entire amount to buy a limited edition designer handbag and a luxury spa vacation. He told them exactly which bank account she used to hide the stolen charity funds. Brittany shrieked in pure panic as he exposed her secret crimes. She retaliated by telling the prosecutor about Terrell's illegal gambling debts. She exposed the private poker games he hosted at the downtown luxury hotels using stolen corporate funds to pay off his massive losses to shady underground bookies. She gave the federal agents the exact names and locations of the illegal gambling rings. They were completely tearing each other apart like two starving rabid dogs fighting over a bone. They were voluntarily handing the federal prosecutor a massive treasure trove of new felony charges just to inflict maximum pain on each other. They were so deeply blinded by their own selfish rage that they forgot they were sitting in a federal building surrounded by law enforcement officers actively taking notes on every single word they screamed. The prosecutor stood at the head of the table watching the absolute beautiful chaos unfold. He did not try to stop them. He just let them completely destroy whatever tiny legal defenses they had left. When they finally ran out of breath, panting heavily and glaring at each other with pure hatred, the prosecutor slowly reached out and pulled the 2 plea agreements back across the table. He placed the documents into his briefcase and snapped it shut. The loud metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the room. The prosecutor looked at the exhausted attorneys and then looked down at Terrell and Brittany. He calmly stated that since the defendants were clearly unable to reach a cooperative agreement and had just voluntarily confessed to several new massive uncharged federal crimes, the global plea offer was officially and permanently withdrawn. He told them he would see them both at the main trial, and he promised he would ask the federal judge for the absolute maximum consecutive sentences. Brittany suddenly realized exactly what she had just done. She looked at the empty space on the table where her 8-year lifeline used to be. She let out a low, pathetic whimper, burying her face in her trembling hands. Terrell just stared blankly at the wall, completely drained, completely broken, and entirely doomed. I stood up from my chair in the back corner of the room. I buttoned my bespoke suit jacket and walked slowly toward the door. I did not say a single word to my son or his wife. I did not need to. They had just built their own massive concrete prisons and locked themselves inside. I walked out into the bright hallway of the federal courthouse, feeling the warm air against my face. The absolute destruction of their toxic alliance was a total masterpiece. The only thing left to do was stand before the judge and watch the final heavy hammer of justice permanently crush their arrogant world. The days leading up to the official federal sentencing hearing were quiet and deeply reflective. I spent most of my time at the corporate headquarters ensuring that Crawford Logistics was fully stabilized after the massive financial shock. The board of directors was entirely behind me, and the employees were relieved to see the founder back in the executive chair. But while my professional life was returning to absolute perfect order, the shattered remnants of my son's fake aristocratic world were still desperately trying to crawl out of the ruins. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when my private security chief knocked on the heavy wooden door of my office. He stepped inside and informed me that 2 individuals were currently waiting at the main security desk in the lobby. He said they did not have an appointment, but they were practically begging to see me. It was Richard and Susan, the parents of the woman who was about to spend the best years of her life in a federal penitentiary. I told my security chief to let them up. I wanted to see exactly what complete and total defeat looked like on the faces of people who had spent their entire lives looking down on everyone else. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my executive suite opened. Richard and Susan walked in, and the sight of them was absolutely pathetic. These were the same people who used to host lavish country club galas. They used to wear custom-tailored suits and expensive diamond necklaces. They used to sip imported champagne and mock the way I spoke or the clothes I wore. Now they looked like entirely different people. Richard was wearing a cheap faded sweater that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His face was unshaven and his eyes were dark and hollow. Susan looked even worse. Her expensive blonde highlights were fading, showing heavy roots of gray, and her posture was completely hunched. They did not have their luxury vehicles anymore. They had taken a cheap city bus to get to my downtown building because their entire estate had been completely seized by the ruthless bail bondsman. They stood awkwardly on the plush carpet of my office, too terrified to even take a seat on the leather sofa. I did not offer them a cup of coffee. I did not stand up to greet them. I simply sat behind my massive mahogany desk, folding my hands and waiting for them to speak. Richard cleared his throat nervously. He looked at the floor, entirely unable to meet my eyes. He started talking in a low, trembling voice that was completely stripped of its former arrogance. He told me that the sentencing hearing for Brittany and Terrell was scheduled for Monday morning. He said the federal prosecutor was pushing for the absolute maximum penalty because the plea deal had completely fallen apart in the interrogation room. Then Susan began to weep. It was not the fake, manipulative crying her daughter used on social media. It was the deep, ugly sobbing of a mother who finally knew her child was about to be locked in a concrete cage for a very long time. She stepped forward and actually fell to her knees right in front of my desk. She placed her trembling hands on the polished wood and begged me for mercy. She pleaded with me to contact the federal judge. She asked me to submit a formal victim impact statement asking for extreme leniency for Brittany. She claimed that Brittany was fundamentally a good person who simply got caught up in a bad situation. She had the absolute audacity to look me in the eye and say that Brittany was fragile and that a young white woman from a good suburban family would not survive a decade in a maximum security federal prison. She begged me to remember that we were all family and that forgiveness was the only way to heal the deep wounds we all shared. I sat perfectly still, listening to their pathetic, desperate pleas. I looked at Richard, who was now wiping tears from his own dirty face, nodding along with his wife. They were completely humiliating themselves in front of the elderly black man they had always secretly despised. When Susan finally ran out of breath, I leaned forward slightly. The silence in my office was heavy and entirely unforgiving. I asked Susan to stand up. I told her that crawling on my floor was not going to change the past or erase the massive federal crimes her daughter committed. She slowly got to her feet, leaning heavily against Richard for physical support. I looked at both of them and let the cold, absolute reality of the situation settle over the room. I reminded them of the Easter dinner just a few months ago. I painted the picture perfectly for them so they could never forget it. I reminded them of the long custom dining table. I reminded them of the expensive red wine they were drinking on my dime. I looked right into Richard's hollow eyes and recalled exactly how he had looked at me that night. I told him I remembered the quiet, condescending smirks. I remembered the subtle microaggressions, the little comments about my manners and my simple background. They sat at my table in my house eating the food my money paid for, and they looked at me like I was the hired help. They thought they were the absolute peak of high society and that I was just a lucky, uneducated truck driver who did not belong in their pristine world. Then I turned my severe gaze to Susan. I reminded her of the exact moment her precious daughter Brittany picked up that heavy crystal glass. I described the dark red liquid flying across the table and soaking deeply into the pale blue linen shirt my late wife Yvonne had bought for me. I asked them both a very simple question. I asked them what they did when that happened. The answer was absolutely nothing. They did not gasp in horror. They did not scold their entitled daughter. They did not offer me a napkin or a basic human apology. Richard had chuckled, and Susan had simply rolled her eyes. They sat there in their arrogant silence, silently endorsing the violent disrespect of an elderly man in his own home. They thought I was useless, and they thought their daughter was entirely untouchable. "You come into my office and ask for mercy," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling frequency. "You ask me to save your daughter because you think she is far too good for a federal prison cell. You think her background and her expensive education should somehow shield her from the absolute consequences of her massive criminal actions. You think the rules that apply to everyday hardworking people should not apply to your precious country club family." Richard opened his mouth to protest, to offer some weak, pathetic excuse, but I raised my hand and stopped him instantly. "You watched her steal millions of dollars from the logistics company I built with my bare hands," I told them, my voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "You watched her set up fraudulent offshore accounts, and you gladly lived in the luxury vacation homes my stolen money paid for. You never once questioned where the sudden extreme wealth was coming from because you felt you inherently deserved it." I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked slowly around the massive desk. I stopped just a few feet away from them, forcing them to look directly into my unwavering eyes. The absolute destruction of their false superiority was finally complete. The supreme arrogance you carried your entire lives is not going to save your daughter today, I said, speaking slowly so every single word carved itself permanently into their memories. The federal justice system does not care about your old country club memberships. It does not care about your upscale zip code or your faded designer clothes. The law does not discriminate by skin color, and neither do I. Your daughter is a thief, a fraud, and a toxic manipulator. She is going to stand before that federal judge on Monday morning, and she is going to reap the exact bitter harvest she spent the last year planting. Susan let out a loud, tragic wail, covering her face with her trembling hands. Richard wrapped his arms around her, his own shoulders shaking with absolute total defeat. They realized that the old man they had mocked was not going to save them. The safety net was completely gone, and the hard concrete floor was rushing up to meet them. I pointed toward the heavy glass doors of my office. I told them our meeting was officially over. I told them to leave my building and never attempt to contact me or my legal team ever again. They did not say another word. They turned around and walked slowly out of the room, completely broken, completely bankrupt, and entirely devoid of hope. They shuffled toward the elevator, looking exactly like the empty hollow shells they had always been on the inside. I walked back around my desk and sat down, looking out the massive windows at the sprawling city skyline. I felt a deep, profound peace settling over my soul. The final loose ends of their toxic, aristocratic family had been completely severed. The stage was now perfectly set for the final courtroom reckoning, where the heavy hammer of the law would permanently crush whatever tiny fragments of their false empire still remained. The federal courthouse was a massive structure of white marble and polished oak. It was a building designed to make every single person who walked through its heavy doors feel incredibly small. But as I walked up the wide stone steps on that cold Monday morning, I did not feel small. I felt like a man who had finally finished a long, exhausting marathon. My lawyer Kendrick walked silently beside me carrying his leather briefcase. I was wearing a classic black tailored suit. I wore a pale blue pocket square folded neatly over my heart in quiet honor of my late wife Yvonne. This was the exact day she would have wanted to see. She always believed in absolute justice, and today the federal government was going to deliver it on a silver platter. We entered the grand courtroom and took our seats in the front row right behind the prosecutor's table. The gallery was packed with local reporters, former business associates, and curious onlookers who had followed the massive corporate scandal on the evening news. The heavy wooden door on the side of the room opened and the federal bailiffs led the defendants in. It was a truly pathetic parade of broken arrogance. Chad walked in first. The tech bro visionary was wearing a baggy khaki prison uniform. His shoulders were slumped and he kept his head down, staring at his cheap canvas shoes. Then came my son Terrell. He looked completely aged. His hair was unkempt and his face was pale and hollow. He dragged his feet across the carpet, entirely defeated by his own cowardice. Finally, Brittany was escorted into the room. The country club princess who had once obsessed over designer labels and expensive wine was wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit. Her wrists and ankles were secured with heavy steel chains that clinked loudly in the silent courtroom. She looked absolutely terrified. Her wealthy parents, Richard and Susan, were sitting in the back row, weeping quietly into their hands. The bailiff announced the arrival of the federal judge. Everyone in the room stood up. The judge was an older, stern-looking man with a reputation for handing down incredibly harsh sentences to white-collar criminals. He sat down at the high mahogany bench and looked over his thick reading glasses at the three trembling individuals standing before him. He did not look impressed. He looked at them with profound professional disgust. The sentencing hearing began. The federal prosecutor stood up and briefly summarized the absolute mountain of evidence they had collected. He mentioned the fake vendor accounts, the offshore shell companies, the money laundering through the fake logistics startup, and the secret biometric floor safe hidden in my master bedroom closet. He reminded the court that all three defendants had completely refused to cooperate until they were turning on each other out of pure spite. Then the judge leaned forward and folded his hands on the bench. He looked directly at Brittany and Terrell. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the heavy air conditioning humming in the ceiling. The judge began to speak. He said that in his 25 years on the federal bench, he had seen many cases of corporate greed and financial manipulation. He said people steal money for many different reasons, but he noted that this specific case was fundamentally different. He stated that the financial crimes committed here were driven by a toxic combination of supreme arrogance and a complete lack of basic human decency. The judge picked up a physical file folder and opened it. He looked right at Brittany. He told her that he had personally reviewed the unedited security camera footage from the Easter dinner. He described the video in brutal, exact detail for the official court record. He talked about her sitting at a dining table paid for by stolen money, laughing cruelly at the elderly black man who had funded her entire lavish existence. The judge raised his voice slightly, his tone turning cold and furious. He told Brittany that throwing a glass of wine into the face of a 73-year-old man was not just a simple family argument. He explicitly classified the incident as a calculated act of severe elder abuse. He said it demonstrated a profound sickness in her character. He stated that her actions proved she had absolutely no remorse, no respect for human dignity, and no redeeming moral qualities. The judge declared that the elder abuse and the subsequent attempt to manipulate the public with fake social media videos were massive aggravating factors in his final decision. Brittany began to sob openly, shaking her head in a pathetic attempt to silently beg for mercy. But the judge was completely finished listening to her lies. He turned his attention to Chad first. He told the young man that stealing federal property and laundering stolen corporate funds to build a fake technology empire was a severe violation of the public trust. The judge sentenced Chad to 5 straight years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Chad collapsed into his chair, weeping loudly as the bailiff stood behind him. 5 years of his youth completely gone because he thought he was smarter than an old truck driver. Next, the judge looked at Terrell. My son stood up, his knees visibly trembling. He looked back at me over his shoulder for just 1 second. His eyes were completely filled with absolute profound sorrow and pure regret. He finally realized the massive, unforgivable mistake he had made by choosing a toxic, manipulative woman over the father who loved him. But it was far too late for apologies. The judge told Terrell that as the chief executive officer, he had a fiduciary duty to protect the employees of Crawford Logistics. Instead, he had acted like a cowardly thief, bleeding his own family legacy dry to appease his greedy wife. The judge sentenced Terrell to 8 years in a federal prison. 8 years locked in a concrete box, completely isolated from the world he thought he ruled. Terrell closed his eyes and let his head drop forward, accepting his total destruction. Finally, the judge fixed his cold, severe gaze entirely on Brittany. She was shaking so violently that the steel chains around her wrists rattled against the wooden defense table. The judge did not hold back. He told her she was the true mastermind behind the emotional and financial devastation of my family. He cited her active attempt to flee the country, her hidden stash of stolen diamonds and cash, and her malicious campaign to destroy my public reputation. He called her a parasitic danger to society. With a voice that echoed like thunder across the marble courtroom, the judge delivered her absolute final reckoning. He sentenced Brittany to 12 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Brittany let out a loud, piercing shriek. Her knees buckled, and she completely collapsed toward the floor. 2 heavy federal bailiffs had to catch her by the arms and drag her back up to her feet. She was screaming for her mother, she was screaming for her lawyer, she was screaming that it was completely unfair. Her arrogant country club illusions were violently, permanently shattered. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was federal inmate number 4729, and she was going to spend the next decade of her life sleeping on a thin mattress in a cold concrete cell. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down hard on the sounding block. The sharp, loud crack echoed through the massive courtroom, bringing the entire hearing to an absolute definitive end. The sound of that gavel was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of complete, undeniable closure. The bailiffs immediately grabbed the 3 defendants and began marching them toward the side door that led directly to the federal transport buses. Terrell did not look back again. Chad was sobbing too hard to even walk straight. Brittany was completely hysterical, dragging her feet and fighting the officers as they pulled her into the dark holding area. I sat in my chair for a long moment, listening to the heavy wooden door click shut behind them. The toxic infection that had poisoned my life was finally completely excised. I slowly stood up and buttoned my black suit jacket. Kendrick placed a respectful hand on my shoulder, nodding silently. We turned around and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The reporters and the spectators parted like the Red Sea, completely stepping out of our way. I walked out through the heavy double doors and stepped into the bright, warm sunshine of the city. The air tasted incredibly sweet. My empire was safe. My dignity was intact. And the legacy of Yvonne and Desmond Crawford was finally secure. The federal courthouse had been a battlefield of marble and wood, but the real war had always been fought inside the walls of my own home. After the judge brought down the heavy wooden gavel and sent my son and his toxic wife to federal prison, I did not go back to my downtown corporate penthouse. I told my driver to take me straight to the sprawling suburban mansion. The house had been empty for a few days since the federal agents finished their final sweep of the property, but the physical space still carried the heavy, suffocating residue of the people who had infected it. I unlocked the heavy front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The silence in the house was no longer tense or hostile, but the visual landscape was completely disgusting to me. Brittany had spent the last 3 years using my stolen corporate money to systematically erase the soul of my home. My late wife, Yvonne, had designed this house to be a sanctuary of warmth and classic elegance. Yvonne loved rich earth tones, deep mahogany woodwork, and soft, inviting fabrics that made a large house feel like a true family home. Brittany hated all of it. When she moved in, she went on a massive spending spree, completely gutting the heart of the estate to match her cold, sterile country club aesthetic. She painted the warm walls a clinical shade of stark white. She covered the beautiful original hardwood floors with expensive but hideously modern gray rugs that looked like they belonged in a corporate waiting room rather than a living room. She replaced Yvonne's beautiful landscape oil paintings with massive pieces of abstract metallic art that had absolutely no meaning and no soul. Walking through the rooms felt like walking through a museum dedicated entirely to arrogant greed. I walked into the grand formal dining room where the infamous Easter dinner had taken place. The massive custom mahogany table I had purchased decades ago was still there, but Brittany had surrounded it with incredibly uncomfortable clear acrylic chairs that cost $3,000 each. I looked at the exact spot where I had been sitting when she threw the dark red wine into my face. I could almost hear the echo of her cruel, mocking laughter bouncing off the stark white walls. I decided right then and there that I was not going to spend a single night in this house until every last trace of her existence was violently ripped out and thrown into the garbage where it belonged. Early the next morning, I hired a premium interior demolition and restoration crew. I did not want this project to take weeks. I wanted it done in days. I paid them triple their usual commercial rate to bring a massive team and work around the clock. By 8 o'clock in the morning, there were 4 massive industrial steel dumpsters parked in my wide circular driveway. I stood in the center of the grand foyer holding a cup of strong black coffee, pointing my finger at every single item that offended my eyes. I told the crew foreman to start in the living room. I watched with absolute profound satisfaction as 4 muscular workers picked up Brittany's custom-made pale gray velvet sectional sofa and carried it straight out the front doors, tossing it unceremoniously over the high metal rim of the dumpster. I told them to take down the massive, ridiculous crystal chandelier she had installed in the entryway. It was an obnoxious piece of glass that cast cold, harsh light across the room. They dismantled it piece by piece and threw it into the trash. I walked through the hallways, directing the workers to pull every single piece of abstract metallic art off the walls. I had them rip up the sterile gray rugs, exposing the beautiful classic hardwood floors underneath. The master suite on the second floor required the most aggressive cleansing. The demolition crew had already torn up the floorboards in the closet to extract the hidden biometric safe, but I told them to keep going. I ordered them to completely gut the master bathroom. Brittany had spent a fortune installing cold white marble everywhere, making the room feel like a sterile surgical suite. I had them smash the marble with heavy sledgehammers. The loud, rhythmic, booming sounds of destruction echoed through the entire mansion, but it did not give me a headache. To me, the sound of breaking marble and shattering acrylic was a beautiful symphony of absolute redemption. It was the sound of a deep, toxic infection being forcibly scraped out of the bones of my house. Once the heavy roll-off dumpsters were completely filled with her expensive, soulless garbage and hauled away, the true restoration process began. I brought in a team of master painters and carpenters. I handed the lead designer a thick photo album filled with pictures of the house from 10 years ago when Yvonne was still alive. I told the designer I wanted the house to look exactly the way it did in those photographs. For the next 5 days, the house was a hive of intense, beautiful activity. The clinical, stark white walls were painted over with the warm, rich earth tones Yvonne had originally chosen. The classic wooden baseboards were sanded down and polished until they gleamed with a deep, natural luster. I had my security team retrieve a massive, secure storage unit from a climate-controlled warehouse downtown. Inside that unit were all the original pieces of furniture, the classic oil paintings, and the framed family photographs that Brittany had arrogantly banished to the basement when she first moved in. I carefully supervised as the workers brought each piece back into the natural light of the house. We hung Yvonne's favorite landscape painting back over the grand stone fireplace. We placed the warm woven rugs back over the polished hardwood floors. I even brought back the comfortable, oversized leather sofas that actually felt like home. The sterile corporate museum was completely gone, and the soul of the Crawford family sanctuary was fully restored. The entire house smelled of fresh paint, lemon wood polish, and the sweet, lingering memory of the woman who had helped me build this empire. By late Saturday afternoon, the restoration was entirely complete. The massive crew packed up their heavy tools, loaded their trucks, and drove quietly down the long concrete driveway. I locked the heavy front doors and turned around to face the grand foyer. The silence in the house was absolutely breathtaking. It was not the heavy, tense silence of a home filled with unspoken resentment and hidden crimes. It was the deep, profound, peaceful silence of a completely secure fortress. There was no arrogant laughter echoing down the hallways. There were no hushed arguments about offshore bank accounts. There was just the gentle hum of the central air conditioning and the soft, golden light of the setting sun pouring through the large bay windows. I walked slowly into the formal living room. The space felt warm and incredibly inviting. I walked over to the antique wooden liquor cabinet in the corner of the room. I opened the glass door and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter filled with my most expensive premium aged bourbon. I poured a generous amount of the dark amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. The ice clinked softly against the sides, making a pleasant, quiet sound in the empty room. I walked over to my favorite oversized leather armchair right next to the grand stone fireplace. I sat down feeling the familiar worn leather support my tired back. I rested my arm on the armrest and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. The smooth, fiery liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, warming my entire chest. I looked around the beautiful, restored living room. I looked at the spot where Richard used to stand boasting about his fake investments. He was gone. I looked toward the dining room where Brittany had thrown the wine in my face. She was gone. I thought about my cowardly son Terrell sitting in a cold concrete federal cell, completely stripped of his fake power. The toxic weeds had been entirely pulled from the soil, and the garden was finally safe again. I leaned my head back against the soft leather of the armchair and closed my eyes. The battle was officially over. I had protected my legacy. I had protected my company. I had protected the honor of my late wife. The old man they thought was useless had completely outsmarted, outplayed, and outlasted every single one of them. I took another slow sip of the premium bourbon, letting the absolute unbroken stillness of the evening wash over me. For the first time in 5 years, I was completely, totally, and beautifully alone in my own home, and it was absolutely perfect. The Monday morning after the federal judge delivered his harsh sentencing, I did not stay home to rest in my quiet, restored mansion. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, put on my sharpest, custom-tailored navy blue suit, and drove myself downtown to the massive glass tower of Crawford Logistics. For 8 long months, I had played the role of a fading, senile old man, shuffling through the corporate hallways while my son and his toxic wife bled my life work entirely dry. But as I walked through the heavy glass doors of the main lobby that morning, the entire atmosphere of the building completely shifted. The security guards stood up perfectly straight, nodding with deep respect. The receptionist smiled with genuine, profound relief. The hardworking employees who had been terrified of losing their pensions under Terrell's incompetent leadership looked at me like a massive, dark storm cloud had finally cleared away from the sky. I walked directly into the executive boardroom where the senior vice presidents and regional managers were nervously waiting for my arrival. I sat down at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. I did not give a long, dramatic speech or talk about the massive federal scandal that had just rocked our foundation. I simply looked at the men and women who had helped me build this logistics empire from the ground up, and I told them that the vacation was officially over and it was time to get back to real, honest work. We spent the next 3 months aggressively repairing the massive financial damage Brittany and Terrell had caused. We recovered the stolen offshore assets, we stabilized the damaged vendor contracts, and we personally called and rehired every single honest truck driver and mechanic my son had wrongfully terminated. I walked the freight yards again, smelling the familiar thick scent of diesel fuel and fresh asphalt. I shook hands with the men loading the trailers. The logistics empire was completely secure again, and it was running smoother and more profitably than it ever had before. But simply restoring the corporate balance sheet was not enough for my soul. When you survive a massive, devastating betrayal that rocks the very foundation of your own family, you quickly realize that true legacy is not just about accumulating endless wealth. It is about exactly whose hands you choose to leave that wealth in. I looked at my son Terrell, a boy who grew up with absolute luxury and absolute privilege, and I saw how I had let greed and country club entitlement turn him into a federal criminal. I realized I had given him far too much and expected far too little in return. I was not going to make that exact same mistake with my hard-earned fortune ever again. So I took $5 million of my own personal capital, and I officially established a massive educational trust. I named it the Yvonne Crawford Memorial Scholarship Fund. I set it up specifically to provide full academic scholarships and comprehensive business grants for young, hardworking Black children from the exact same struggling city neighborhoods where my beautiful Yvonne and I grew up. I wanted to find the kids who had real grit. I wanted to find the young students who were eating cold, cheap sandwiches on crowded city buses, reading borrowed library textbooks, and dreaming of building their own massive empires one day. I wanted to give my wealth to young men and women who actually understood the profound value of a hard-earned dollar instead of an arrogant son who thought money was just a cheap tool to impress his toxic, condescending wife. I remember handing the very first scholarship check to a brilliant young girl who wanted to study mechanical engineering. I saw the tears of genuine gratitude in her parents' eyes, and I immediately thought about the fake manipulative tears Richard and Susan had cried in my office. The contrast was absolutely staggering. When I signed the final legal documents to officially launch the foundation, I looked at a framed photograph of Yvonne sitting on my heavy wooden desk. I knew she was looking down at me with a beautiful, proud smile. We were finally investing our legacy into people who actually deserved to inherit it. Sitting in my quiet, restored mansion during the long, peaceful evenings, I have had a lot of time to reflect on the true value of respect, the corrupting nature of unearned money, and the absolute limits of family ties. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned from a very young age to believe that because we brought a child into this world, we must endure absolutely any level of disrespect, manipulation, or abuse they choose to throw at us. We are told that a good father always forgives and forgets. But I learned the incredibly hard way that offering unconditional forgiveness to a truly toxic person is just handing them a loaded weapon and apologizing when they shoot you with it. Terrell and Brittany thought my old age made me weak and helpless. They thought the natural love I had for my only son would completely blind me to the millions of dollars they were actively stealing right under my nose. They mistook my patient, calculating silence for senility. They simply did not understand that a man who can build a massive corporate empire from the dirt up possesses a level of ruthless survival instinct that a spoiled, entitled child could never possibly comprehend. Money is just a magnifying glass. It does not change who you really are deep down inside. It only magnifies exactly what is already hiding in your heart. It gave Brittany the power to show her true, cruel, manipulative nature. It gave Terrell the comfort to display his absolute pathetic cowardice. And it gave me the exact heavy tools I needed to completely dismantle their fake aristocratic world and lock them all in federal concrete boxes. I do not regret calling the federal agents that night. I do not regret sitting in that cold, sterile interrogation room and looking my weeping son in the eye and telling him I was there to watch him pay the heavy price for his betrayal. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can actually do is step completely out of the way and let the heavy, concrete consequences of reality crush the blinding arrogance out of their child. I found my true, absolute peace the exact moment I accepted that I cannot buy solid character for my son, and I cannot save a man who actively chooses to tie an anchor around his own neck and drown. I sit on my back porch now watching the golden sunset over the manicured green lawns. The air is warm and perfectly still. There are no more fake socialite parties in my grand foyer. There are no more hushed arguments about offshore accounts or country club memberships. There is only the quiet, deep satisfaction of a life completely rebuilt and a family legacy violently protected. The fortune I built hauling heavy freight through freezing rain and endless sleepless nights will no longer be squandered on designer bags or illegal gambling debts. It will build schools. It will fund community centers. It will create an entire generation of strong, educated, independent young people who will never let anyone throw a glass of wine in their face. I look back at that Easter dinner not with anger but with profound, beautiful clarity. That single glass of dark red wine was the ultimate catalyst for the greatest cleansing of my entire life. It washed away the toxic illusions. It revealed the absolute ugly truth hiding at my table. And it allowed me to finally reclaim the throne I had foolishly stepped away from. You can only be betrayed by the people you actively trust. So I stopped trusting the people who only loved my money, and I started trusting the absolute certainty of my own hard boundaries. The empire is safe. The king is back in his executive chair. And the garbage has been permanently removed from the premises. Love is unconditional, but access to your life and your legacy is not. We often tolerate the deepest disrespect from our own blood, confusing silence with strength and endurance with parenting. But when arrogance blinds them to the sacrifices that built their comfort, letting them fall is the only true lesson left to teach. You cannot buy character, and you cannot fix a rotten foundation with forgiveness. Stand tall, protect what you built, and never let anyone, family, or not make you feel useless in the empire you created. Sometimes the most powerful words a parent can say are, "No more." Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you found real value in these hard lessons and believe in standing up for your own dignity against toxic family members, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Let me know in the comments section below if you have ever had to make the incredibly hard decision to cut off a toxic relative to protect your own mental peace and your hard-earned legacy. Share this video with someone who might really need the courage to set their own hard, unbreakable boundaries today. Stay strong, protect your peace at all costs, and I will see you in the next video.